Mr. President, Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, Ambassadors, distinguished guests, dear friends, most welcome to this event on building a resilient future through water. Firstly, I'm very honored to welcome the head of state from Hungary, who has been so instrumental in positioning water at the global level. Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. János Áder, President of Hungary, for joining us this morning. And Hungary, as we all know, has been endeavored greatly to ensure that water has a dedicated SDG, number 6, that's the goal among the Sustainable Development Goals. But you have also forwarding water on the international scene by running the Budapest Water Summit, and you are yourself also a member of the Heads of State panel, or high-level panel on water, which was established a year and a half ago by the then Secretary General of United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and the President of World Bank, Jim Kim. And you will report back on your outcome of that panel to the World Water Forum in Brasilia. But you are also, Mr. President, a supporter of future water heroes. And we had the pleasure of welcoming you on Tuesday night when you attended the Stockholm Junior Water Prize Award ceremony. I'm also very delighted that Your Excellency, Ms. Sharafat Afilal, Secretary of State in charge of water from Morocco, is with us today. Once more, you were here last year as well, so we're most welcome to World Water Week and to this session this year. And Morocco have been a forwarding country and nation also in forwarding the water issue on the global scale. You're still presidency of the Conference of the Parties of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COPs. And you ran the COP22 in Marrakesh last year with great success, where we have an official water day, and that is thanks to you and your government that made that possible. Now, speaking about climate change, we know that all parties to the Climate Change Convention are coming up with their plans how to implement the Paris Agreement. What is labeled is a very strange acronym, these NDCs, the National Determined Contributions. And when we read them through, we find that almost all of them have water, especially when you look upon all African nations and all developing countries have water as a major part of it. Because when it comes to reality, to implement the Paris Agreement, it's a lot about water. And we know that climate change is fundamental water, too much or too little water. This session today is kind of serious, that we will combine the Agenda 2030 and the climate change issues, the Paris Agreement, and what came out of the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September 2015, when the members of the UN and all countries around the world adopted the Sustainable Development Goals to bring our two communities together and bridge climate change issues with development issues. And we believe, as we have said over and over this week, that water is very instrumental in achieving the SDGs. And I think also bringing together the climate change issues with the development issues is key and crucial to achieve not only the Paris Agreement, but also the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. And this event today, we are co-partnering with Rockefeller Foundation and running this from the resilience theme. And this morning we had a discussion, a business leaders breakfast, when we discussed to bring in and also reach out to the business sector. And I think this is one idea we have with the World Water Week, that bring in different actors from different disciplines, be they business, be they, like today, heads of state or cabinet ministers, researchers, which was the fundamental part when the World Water Week started 20 years ago, but also actors from civil society, international organizations, governments, because we are all in together, but also reach out to other communities. And I think it's very crucial, and we would like to continue with this in the future years to come, also to have this, if it's Thursday morning, I don't know next year, but it will be definitely sessions on climate change and Agenda 2030, and also to see where we are on the global scale in progressing on the SDGs and on Paris Agreement. Now, I would like to invite Your Excellency, President János Áder, President of Hungary, to join me on stage for your speech. And there will be interpretation to English on your headphones. Channel number 1, Mr. President.
Good morning, esteemed ladies and gentlemen. I will wait while you all get your headsets ready, find channel 1. I would like to, meanwhile, share with you a very short story. When I actually met with the organizers of the event today morning, and I was telling them, 10 minutes that you gave me is not going to be enough for me to actually tell my ideas in a merit. And I said to them that in past years, the average length of my presentations were among 90 to 120 minutes. Well, they looked at me aghast. I do hope I've managed to wake you up and to dispel any dismay. Well, I can tell you that I've managed to ensure 15 minutes. So can we please start the clock now? Esteemed ladies and gentlemen, just now we already heard from the director, Torgny Holmgren, and everybody else knows here in the room that it was 2 years ago that the UN General Assembly actually adopted the 17 SDGs, which actually set out until 2030 the tasks that we have for us to actually do and the objectives to achieve. Everybody here in the room knows, but of course I have to start with something, so there needs to be an introduction, that it was also 2 years ago, it's going to be 2 years in December to be very precise, that we adopted the Paris Agreement, which set the objective of actually ensuring that we remain below 2 degrees centigrade in terms of the temperature increase. Well, there's 2 questions that can be, of course, derived from today's topic. The first one is, how can we link the 2 events? How can we link New York with Paris? And the other question is, can we just lean back in our chairs, content with the decisions in New York and Paris? The first picture that I'll be showing you is basically that when you look at the 17 SDGs that have been adopted, there is one, and that is SDG 6, that has to do with water and sanitation, sustainable water management and sanitation as mentioned. Well, this one is one that links 14 others in a way that their fate depends on this one. If SDG 6 cannot be resolved and achieved in the period we have available, then we can be sure that we won't have a response, an adequate response to urbanization challenges, food production conditions, the poverty issues, and I won't enumerate all the others. You can really see them listed here on this picture. Paris has proven to us, and I hope there are many of us, that when it comes to the importance of climate protection, it's something we've gotten through. People understand. Some decision makers still need to be enlightened, like the American president, but all the others do not need to be convinced anymore that we need to transform energy production. We need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, and we need to reduce greenhouse gases because these are indispensable for us. I think this realization was adopted or accepted 95% in Paris. But the political realization of the looming water crisis is still yet to come, when in fact the impacts of climate change, and this has become scientific cliché, at least 80% of climate change impact is felt through water. And what you can see here is that whatever has to do with energy, energy management, weaning off fossil energy is, when it comes to adaptation, boils down to water and responsible water management. So again, we can pose the same question. Can we be content? Can we be satisfied with New York and with Paris? Can we just sit on our laurels? I have 5 statements that I'd like to respond in. Brief responses, I promise. I would just like to give them, propose them as food for thought for all of you. We can safely say that we are at a crossroads. We have to choose which way we want to go. Number 1, urbanization. You can see here a photo from Manila, Philippines, but I could show you pictures from all around the world, South America, South Africa, any parts of Asia and others. It's quite clear, everybody knows, that nowadays we have more than 50% of the world's population, 52%, living in cities. And if this trend continues, then by 2030, which is a generation from now, more than 75% of the global population will be city dwellers, which will mean that out of 4 people on Earth, 3 will be living in cities. If we do other kinds of calculations, if we have another approach, if we want to say, put it in other words, we can say that by 2050, the urban population will double in number. Today, urban population consumes about 25 to 30% of all water. If they will double in number by 2050, and we will just stick with these same traditional methods and urbanization methods, we will not be able to double the quantity of water required to supply the double quantity population, especially if, at the same time, 80% of wastewater is returned to the rivers and lakes and seas untreated, which means that at the same time we are actually making our situation worse when it comes to having to feed the ever-growing urban population. We need new solutions. This, for example, here is a solution from Jordan. We need new solutions in water management, water treatment, transportation of water, wastewater treatment, especially if we could convert it immediately to potable water. So our whole mindset, our whole urban design, and our responses to urbanization need to be completely different in the next coming decades. The second statement, this has to do with food production. Again, this image comes from the Sahel. This is the Sahel region of Africa. Here, currently, there's about 500 million people living. Estimates say that by 2050, again, 1 generation from now, the population will double here in this Sahel region. It is actually definitely worth thinking, and it is very good. You can see the threat that between 2005 and 2010, while the food production stagnated in the Sahel region, during the same period of time, the population increased by more than 100 million. Can you imagine? 2050, the population will double here. There is no modern irrigation. There is, without new drought-resistant crops. If we go back 1 image, let's go back 1 image. This is not yet modern technology. I mean, even with the greatest goodwill, we cannot say that this is modern technology. We need new irrigation technology. We need drought-resistant seeds and new technologies, because without these, this region stands no chance of producing enough food for itself. There are very good examples, other examples in Africa. Kenya is not part of the Sahel region, but there, thanks to a more responsible water management, they have been able to create the conditions to ensure enough food produced, at least in certain parts of the country. But here again, it is worth, and I don't have an image, to point out what is happening or what has happened in India. Well, India itself has actually increased its irrigation capacity through shallow pump wells for irrigation. There's this figure from 1950. So between 1950 and 1990, over a period of 40 years, the number of wells grew from 3,000 to 6 million. So yes, okay, they have wells to actually water their plants. They have the possibility to produce enough food for stuff for themselves. But because of the irresponsible water management, every year the level of water in their wells is decreasing by 30 centimeters. There are some places where they're having to go down a further 8 to 10 meters to find water. And if this goes on like this, 20 years from now, 2/3 of the Indian water base will be depleted or will be threatened with depletion. So while, of course, there is so much mention made of irrigation technologies and water management, I think it's important that we learn from the lessons of other countries. The third statement has to do with the industry. Industry is a rather thirsty sector. It's water intensive. We need to close fundamentally coal power plants. We all know Paris Treaty is there because we need to actually reduce CO2 emission. However, it is not only this that we will want to achieve, but it is also important that few people know that the water consumption of all coal power plants is such that the amount of water that they are using would be enough to actually supply the water needs of more than 1 billion people. So if we were to close coal power plants, we would not only be emitting less CO2, but at the same time we would be saving water for ourselves and others. But I could go to the automotive industry, I could cite for you the textile industry. Few people know to manufacture one car, you need 150,000 liters of water. To produce a pair of jeans, we all wear jeans, I'm not wearing one now, you need 7,500 liters of water for one pair of jeans. So, without actually finding a way to reutilize, recycle this industrial water, to purify it some way, and put it back into the system, I don't think without any solution to that we'll be able to keep up industrialization. The fourth statement of mine has to do with poverty. And I'm sure, let's go back again. One image I was... Well, we saw, first of all, there was the power plant, and now this is an example from Saudi Arabia that I forgot to mention. And the reason I'm mentioning them is because the oil minister of Saudi Arabia said 1 year ago, despite the fact that they are very rich in oil and they find it cheap to actually exploit it, the long-term solution, they said, and the long-term condition for them will be in solar, they have said. Therefore, they are building solar fields in Saudi Arabia. And then now we can move on. So the fourth statement has to do with poverty. I don't have images for you on this, but if we do not find solutions to the demographic boom in certain countries, if we continue to be providing the bad responses to urbanization, if we cannot stop the degradation of soil quality, if they cannot institute some kind of a new agricultural culture, then according to the economic best estimates now in the Middle East, the GDP will reduce by at least 14%. In Central Asia, it will reduce by 11%, and in Eastern Asia, 7%. This kind of an economic decline makes it completely impossible to actually do away with poverty. Fifth statement. Yesterday morning in the very same building, we had quite a lot of talk about shared water resources. Of course, you all know that 40% of the world's population lives in such shared water basins. So basically, rivers and even lakes are being used by several countries at the same time. So in this sense, they are all reliant on one another. So one example I'd like to show you is the Lake Chad. And its example is not only interesting because it really is testament to the dramatic effects of climate change, the way it is actually drying up. It's also because earlier, in 1960, even in 1971, there were 4 countries sharing the water. Today, only 2 countries have access to it. And that is actually creating a very serious conflict in the region. There are positive examples. The example of Senegal could be cited here. And It was said yesterday that, for example, also the collaboration between Ethiopia and Egypt, which wasn't quite so clear earlier and quite evident, there was a threat of even an armed conflict because of the dam being built in Ethiopia. But I think whatever happened there now is a positive example. So we can say that when it comes to shared water basins, on the majority of them, there aren't bilateral or multilateral agreements in place to settle the issues of irrigation, industrial use of water, energy production, or even the consumption of ever-growing cities. And until there are no such agreements in place, there will be a source of continuous political conflict, eventually even an armed conflict. And to actually say that, to mention the political and social consequences of droughts, just two images to remind you. One is Yemen and the other is Syria. We all know the Yemen civil war, and behind the Syrian war, partially, predominantly, there is also a very serious period of drought that preceded them. So 5 statements, and I have 2 minutes. Conclusions, and basically just in bullet points. A few minutes ago, I showed you this very same image. I'd just like to recap on it. So whatever has to do in terms of the prevention of climate change, in our weaning off, becoming independent of fossil fuels, in adaptation, it is translated to sustainable water management. James Bruce said this in a caricature. So my first conclusion is this. The second is that it is not the future that we are talking about. We are talking about present times. We are in Sweden, so let me cite a Swedish example. 2016 was the driest year in Sweden, and this July they had 50% less precipitation than in the entire period before. Don't be fooled by the fact that they have rain today. But there are some parts of islands of Sweden who had to find outside external sources of water because they didn't have enough resources to actually supply Swedish people with. And this is not a very drought-stricken area. The third statement, water climate is not local, it is global. It has an economic, a political and migrational effect which point way beyond the borders of individual countries. And my last conclusion, when it comes to the problems of climate change, water crisis and sustainability, we need to find comprehensive solutions. It was mentioned that there was a high-level water panel convened by the Secretary General, which actually set this very objective to actually come up with solutions that are complementary to one another, that are cognizant of the other areas in order to alleviate the problems of this water crisis. What are the proposals? A few proposals that I have articulated that I'd like to propose to you as a food for thought for further thinking. And really, just one sentence each. By 2050, and this is not me saying this, this is the Stockholm Resilience Center saying that by 2050, every 10 years, we will have to halve, so reduce by half greenhouse gas emission. We were all flabbergasted when the American president left the Paris Agreement. We need new allies. I am proposing that we look at sub-sovereign organizations, cities, states, regions. They be allowed to join the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Many organizations in place, this under to the Americas Pledge, etc. And the third proposal is that in order to actually motivate infrastructure investments, well, we have to double them over the next coming 5 years, double the infrastructure investments. Finally, at least one third of all international resources for climate protection financing should be spent in the water area. Finally, 2 that have to do with the United Nations. We should really think of creating some kind of an intergovernmental organization like IPCC used to be, that would deal specifically with water-related issues within the realm of the UN. This would be one idea. And the second one is the United Nations definitely needs a structural reform. Very few people know that the UN has actually 28 agencies dealing in one way or another with water. If you have 28 different institutions doing the same thing in Hungary, what happens is that the actual subject gets lost amidst all the masters. And of course, last, we need to create some kind of an intergovernmental water collaboration forum within the UN. I have not been able to adhere to the 15 minutes. I even tried to summarize everything. Thank you very much for your attention. I would like to ask you if you agree with any of my proposals. If you agree with the conclusions, please join us so that we can, when it comes to the objectives in New York and Paris, that they do not remain words on paper, but they really become a result and achievement in the future time to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for a very rich, comprehensive, eye-opening speech with fantastic images. Thanks a lot. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now I have a pleasure to invite the speaker from Morocco, Her Excellency Sharafat Al-Filal, who is Secretary of State in charge of water. Please come and join me on the stage. Minister Sharafat. Thank you.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first of all to express my sincere thanks to Stockholm International Water Institute for inviting me and for their tireless efforts in favor to better water governance, particularly in a context that's increasingly threatened by climate change. I would like also to congratulate the organizers in the choice of theme of today's session, building a resilient future through water. Yes, we can do that through water, which is an undeniable concern of countries confronted with challenges of scarcity and climate change effects. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, water is the first victim of climate change. More than 90% of natural disasters are related to water. We pray today for Texas. Climate change affects the water cycle and increase the risks associated to it by increasing shortages and worsening flood intensity. These effects have many repercussions on the economy and through it to the whole stability in the world. Yes, water resources are the key of the peace and the stability into the world because water resources could be a source of problem and the conflict and could be also as a part of solution. Even if we solve the energy issues through the mitigation, we will still have water problem in the world caused by climate change effects, disaster, immigration, conflict, drought, and poverty. We should continue our facing, our struggle, and our lobbying to make water as a priority at the same level as the energy. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, climate change has no boundaries and affects all our countries, and water is certainly the first to be compromised. For this reason, Morocco, with other partners, had worked internationally so that water was positioned as one of the priority themes at the level of conferences of parties during COP22, and it should be so during the next COP23. The International Water Conference held in Rabat and COP22 in Marrakesh mobilized all actors of the water community to better defend the cause of water during the negotiation of climate change. However, we must all strive to ensure that water continues to be at the forefront of priorities at the international level through the maintaining of the international conference, which will be held in Marseille in next October, and also to devotion and honor day during the next COP in Bonn of water. Morocco, who is characterized by the highly contrast climate with the rainfall regime dominated by a strong irregularity in space and time, and still suffering from climate change effects, even if it's not responsible of what is happening in the earth. As a country, ensuring the presidency of COP22 confirms its determination to continue to militate for water, this wonderful cause of water. We should keep the same breath, work hand in hand. We will go to Marseille first. After that, we will go to Bonn to defend our common cause, water, because climate is water. Le climat, c'est l'eau. Thank you for attention.
Maybe technology is with us this morning, but anyway, thanks a lot, Minister Sharafat, for a very fantastic statement. And I think we should give a good hand of applause to Minister Sharafat because she made a Water Action Day at the COP22 in Marrakesh. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Yeah. And now, next on our agenda is a discussion with the panel, and I would like to introduce you to the moderator of this panel, which is Anthony Curry from Reuters Breaking Views, and you will soon invite the panelists. Before that, I would like to also once again thank President János Áder for not just being here with us this morning, but during the World Water Week. You have been engaged every day since you arrived here in Stockholm. Now you have other assignments, I know, coming up, so I will walk you out while Anthony will invite the panel. Thanks a lot, Mr. President. Thanks a lot, Minister Sharafat. And Anthony, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Torgny, and thank you to World Water Week for inviting me to participate. Now, as moderators and panelists go, I'm a little bit of an outlier for World Water Week. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a water expert, at least not by training. Actually, not really at all. I'm a journalist. Worse than that, I'm a financial journalist. If I look back at what I've done, basically I cover banks, I cover car companies, I cover mergers and acquisitions. So what on earth am I doing up here for a panel about policy and water? Well, let me tell you how I got here. It is relevant, so bear with me. I did start off getting interested in water at college. I did a master's thesis on international politics, and I did something on water in the Middle East. That was not recently, let's just put it that way. And doesn't really quite explain why I should be justified standing here. So anyway, I joined a company called Breaking Views 15 years ago. We do financial commentary, as I said. So you're going to see me writing about why XYZ deal with another company is good, bad, ugly, and different. About 4 years ago, and apologies to those in the audience, I've seen a few of you, I've already told you this, I'm going to bore you with this again, I'm sorry. About 4 years ago, a report came across my desk from an investment bank about water, and I thought, finally, I can show to my parents that spending an extra year at college wasn't just a way of me staying out of a career. I actually now can merge my job with my education. Now, this report went into all variety of things of how you could invest in water, what the challenges were, and we wrote a piece on it that went out the day before the July the 4th holiday. Despite my accent, I work in New York. We write about 300-400 pieces a month. July, you've got a holiday at the beginning, and then you have a bunch of corporate earnings, which all of our readers, banks, financiers, investors, love to read, especially if I write things like Goldman Sachs, conflicts of interest, traders screwing their clients. That's going to get a huge hit. So at the end of the month, we were looking at the stats for who read what. Our water piece, despite coming out in a big month for corporate earnings and right before a holiday, was a top 10 story. And this told us two things. One, we've probably just discovered a new beat that we should cover, which is why I do it now. And secondly, we realized that the people we deal with on a daily basis, bankers, financiers, investors, hedge funds, private equity, are so interested in water that they want to read what a financial journalist is going to write. So what does that tell us? On top of that, yes, there's self-interest. The people who want to do this, who want to get involved in Wall Street, of course, the bankers and middlemen, they want to make money. Of course they do. And let's be fair, I mean, I covered the financial crisis and the car crisis 10 years ago. I'm well aware that these guys can do things wrong every now and again. But their money is becoming increasingly important. And I think this is my first time at World Water Week, and as I ask people what's changed, one of the biggest things I hear is that people are talking a lot more about finance and about the need for private finance. And there are more people from the private finance sector coming to this event. So, you know, we can't really get away from that. Also, I think there is a bit of fear as well on Wall Street. The investors, not the hedge funds, not the short-term money who just will make money wherever they can, but the long-term money, pension funds, insurance funds, even private equity to some extent. They are all looking at what happens when baby boomers die and pass their money on to millennials who, frankly, are probably more socially conscious and environmentally aware than their parents were, and the likes of, you know, you name your big wealth management firm, HSBC, Morgan Stanley. They don't want to lose that money. So to show that they understand what's going on in climate change and water, and to show that they're willing to finance it, I think for them is a very big thing. And I see more and more reports coming out. Now, how does this fit into what we're talking about this morning? It's very simple. And this, again, is another theme I've come across when talking to people about what is important here. Investors, especially long-term investors, hate uncertainty. And one of the biggest things when they drill down into what's going on in climate change and water, they see that where they see uncertainty is in governance and policy. If they don't have certainty, they don't have, it's a phrase I've got here this week, they do not have the confidence that they can find bankable projects to put their money into. Now, there are many other reasons, of course, why you may or may not want to invest, but that's one of the biggest ones they've got. And that is why I think the panel this morning is one where I can add something slightly different. I'm not going to quite pretend that I'm a financier. I can't pull that off, and probably a good thing too. Nor am I going to pretend that I am a governance expert, although I did, Stefan, I forgot to tell you this, I did actually take a UNESCO IHE course on governance earlier this year, just so I could ramp up my learning a bit. So with that, let's get on to the panel. I'm going to start introducing them. Apologies, I'm going to read off here to make sure I get your titles correct. Lars, I'm going to ask you to come up first. Lars Rannas, who is Sweden's ambassador for climate change. Yeah, thank you. Next up, we have Katarina de Albuquerque, who is executive director of the Sanitation and Water for All. Professor Stefan Uhlenbrock, coordinator of the UN World Water Assessment Programme, and the man who was behind the wastewater report earlier this year, which of course is the theme for the conference. And finally, Lisa Emilia Svensson, Director for Oceans at UN Environment. So welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. Let me start off with, okay, I called it a softball question. It probably isn't. So the overarching theme of the sessions in the auditorium this morning is building a resilient future through water. It's a great word, resilience. But what does it mean when we apply it to water policy? Let me lob that one to you, Katarina.
Thank you, Anthony. Of course, this is not what we had discussed yesterday.
I told
but
you,
that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. You surprise me, I surprise you.
Actually, that worries me, but anyway.
So the question was, how do we deal with it?
What does resilience mean for you when you think about policy?
Okay. Well, resilience. So let me first start by saying that I'm here representing an intergovernmental structure on water. We are, SWA is a global partnership that brings together governments but also other stakeholders. And what we do, I call it AQUA. A, it's advocacy. C, it's convening. W, it's working together. And A is holding our partners accountable. And let me refer to the issues that you were mentioning on financing. So we convene ministers of finance. And I think this this is crucial for the things that you were saying. And when we talk about resilience, resilience is, and how we deal with resilience, or how we ensure resilience, it has to do a lot with the title of the panel, in our opinion, and this is what we call for. It's about making sure that countries and inside countries institutions are ready and able to deal with climate change, to respond to climate change, and to protect those who are the most affected by climate change. And the president of Hungary was referring to poverty. He was referring to vulnerability. He was referring to those who have been left behind. And we think that technological solutions are wonderful, that investments on nice projects are fantastic, but these are mostly unsustainable. And for us to make sure that this becomes sustainable and that resilience happens, meaning that we manage to protect the unprotected, that we manage to plan in a way that makes our cities, our countries, our people able and less vulnerable to climate change, then we have to plan. We have to have a strong, robust cycle of planning, of monitoring, of accountability, and then of course correcting. Did we plan right? Are the measures that we are envisaging the right ones in order to ensure resilience? In my opinion, well, not my opinion, in the opinion of our 170 partners, it has to do with protecting the most vulnerable and in making sure that we lift them up and that we have the proper policies in place to make sure that, that climate change affects us the least possible. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think you've probably just done the panel's job. We can all go home now. No, but okay, so I mean, you've gone through that, a lot of things that we can do. I suppose the big question is, how do we get there? And Lars, I mean, it's almost an extension of the question, what does resilience mean for policy? But how do we get from what Katarina's talking about of knowing what we need to do to actually ensuring that we find ways to do it? So let me put that one to you.
Thank you. I think that comes to the core, what we mean by good water policies now. And as I think has come through here, not least with the President's presentation, water relates to a number of development goals. That also means that there are a number of stakeholders involved when it comes to water. And often you come across conflict of interest. No? We know water relates to energy, sanitation, agriculture, and the like. So I think the first requisite, the first thing you have to, take when you design a water policy is to take a collaborative approach, that you involve the different stakeholders. No? These could be stakeholders who represent different interests, but it could also be at different levels now. It could be locally, regional, or national. No? Water also often has the very particular characteristic of flowing. So it moves geographically as well, no? From source to sea. So how to make sure that how you use water upstreams doesn't mean that you are badly affected downstreams. No? So you have to bring the different stakeholders together. You need to establish transparent mechanisms. No? You need to try and find common grounds for this. And from that basis, you need to design a policy that, there are trade-offs, but everyone has been involved in that process. And later on, I can give you a number of examples on how we have gone about that in Sweden and in other countries where we have been collaborating. Thank you.
Right. Stefan, let me sort of turn to you now. Having been behind the wastewater report earlier this year, that was also the theme of this conference, how do you envisage policy working in that area? I mean, if the president of Hungary mentioned it again, there's 80% of wastewater doesn't get properly treated. There was a report out yesterday, I think, from World Resources Institute saying that, you know, a lot of countries in emerging markets aren't providing enough data on how good or bad water quality is and how good or bad their wastewater and sanitation is. So we're a long way from one of the most crucial parts of the water environment, wastewater, being part of the solution, it seems. So there needs to be good policy around that. Is that something that comes domestically or internationally, do you think, or both?
Thanks. Well, good question. We also, yesterday, we prepared another one, actually. But no,
hey, look, the best thing to do is, as I was told, always answer the question you want to have been asked.
Exactly. No, you know, when we put this report together, we said more than 80% of the wastewater is discharged to the environment untreated, and we cannot give you a better number. So we tried our best. We know that some countries, small island states, some of them, there's no wastewater treatment at all, so it's just discharged into the coastal area without any treatment. In other countries, we do much better. Then there's plenty of decisions. What is wastewater? How do you include agricultural runoff or not? And then the percentages also change. But like a very fuzzy number is more than 80%. So it's very, very large. And why doesn't it take up? You know, when it comes to sanitation, there were quite a number of studies demonstrating that investments in sanitation has a large payback. Every dollar put in there, you know, depending on the country and the conditions, has a return on investment by factor 5 easily. Yeah. So why is it not? And you know, on Sunday morning, I heard the first time. I wish we would have, you know, able to coin that term. You know, it was the brown gold. And I think that's a very telling story, because our report also is entitled "The Wastewater, the Untapped Resource," and it's really about looking at wastewater not as a nuisance you want to discharge to the environment, get rid of because there's some health implication to it. No, it's really about it's a resource. You know, it has water, can help to offset the challenges related to water scarcity. It has interesting nutrients, you know, that can be used in agriculture for improving the food security. It has sometimes industrial wastewater. I think President Otter, in his really engaging speech, he also referred to that. There's innovations in kind of zero liquid discharge industries and trying to utilize the metals that are sometimes in industrial wastewater. And finally, it has organic content. You know, organic content can be used as a source of energy, as bioenergy. And it is possible nowadays to design wastewater treatment plants energy positive. You know, currently, wastewater treatment plants usually use a lot of energy, but it's really we have to change that. So there's a couple of messages how we look at it differently. Is we shouldn't look at it as a burden, as a nuisance. You know, we should really look at the flip side of the coin and see it as a brown gold. You know, but don't quote me, the brown gold was not from us. You know, but I think that's a couple of messages. And how do we get there? A lot of technology, but I think the astronaut on the opening day demonstrated that very clearly. It's not necessarily a question of technology, you know. And the spaceship, which is the ISS, is circulating around the Earth in almost 17 years now, and never an astronaut has been sick because of badly treated wastewater, you know. And there's no rainfall on this spaceship. There's no groundwater body on this spaceship where you can take fresh water, you know. Everything is recycled. It's a circular economy in a very limited space. So technology, it works. It's a question of legislation and many countries actually taking that very seriously and taking up, particularly also in the Arab world. I would like to mention that. 11 out of 22 Arab countries have a very positive legislation here. And leading wastewater recycling in agriculture, at least. It has to do with investments. We maybe discuss that later. It has to do with political will and et cetera, et cetera. Well, you heard that before about the lack of political will, I guess. And finally, it has to do with a lot of awareness, that we really don't see wastewater as a burden, something dangerous. So it has to do with society and all of us. How do we look at wastewater, the brown gold?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to actually, I should have said that we don't generally quote people, so we like to take your ideas and sell them back to you. So the idea of stealing stuff is something I'm going to steal that quote. So one thing, I mean, if putting my financial hat on, you're right. First of all, there's a 4 to 5 times return on investing in wastewater. Also, I think one study I read said there's an up to 4 percentage point hit to GDP purely from death and illness in emerging markets from poorly treated wastewater and the diseases that come from it. If I were a politician, I would think solving that is going to get me re-elected forever. I mean, that to me is like, this should be a rather obvious policy goal that they should be pushing early on. You get better economy, your people love you, arguably, and you can continue in office. I mean, what could be better for a politician than a policy that keeps you in office? What's stopping it, do you think?
It's very difficult. I still feel that investing in wastewater treatment is not considered a very sexy topic at the end, you know. And despite all the advantage you said, sometimes the payback is on a longer period of time, which is maybe a limit to in politics. Sometimes the advantages of wastewater management are difficult to attribute and quantify. So the health improvement, for instance, you know, there's many reasons why people can be sick, and you have these tremendous numbers of every 20 seconds a child dies because of poor hygiene and pure sanitation, which is disgusting. But it doesn't make a headline news anymore. You know, if one airplane crashes, then it's everywhere. You know, say, oh, 200-300 people died because of this airplane crash, and rightfully so. It's very sad. But during this session, you know, we have a 90-minute session, probably 270 children on average die because of poor sanitation and hygiene. It doesn't make it to the breaking news and breaking views anymore, but these are facts. But the investments are often more, what I wanted to say, more indirect. It's not so easy to attribute. And furthermore, it also requires a full economic model. Some of the benefits are societal, difficult to attribute, has to do with preventing costs. For instance, you have a lot of problems with wastewater treatment with the precipitation of struvite. It's a mineral which is clogging the pipes. But instead of clogging the pipes and investing a lot in maintenance, much better to kind of extract that phosphorus-rich mineral before and use it as a fertilizer. It's much better revenue. But these kind of revenue models need to be built in a full economic model, and not just looking at the finance needed for whatever infrastructure.
You've made a fan. Katarina, you wanted to follow up on that.
Well, I wanted to follow up on that because, well, not only do I agree with everything that Stefan just said, but I also wanted to say that it is crucial to bring not only the converted together, and the converted are those sitting here in this room today and attending World Water Week this week. We are the converted, and it's very nice to be here during this week. It's very nice, and it's not only nice, it is very important for us to be here, but I think we need to reach out to others. And one of the others that we have to reach out are obviously the heads of state, like the President of Hungary and heads of government, etc. I fully agree, the importance of the high-level panel, but very crucially, the ministers of finance. And very humbly, I would like to say that we try with SWA to bring the ministers of finance around the table. And I agree with Stefan, it's not easy. So we had the finance, we've been doing it since 2010, every 2 years. And the meetings are hosted by the World Bank. We did it this year with the Deputy Secretary General, with the President of the World Bank, with ministers of finance. And this is indispensable for them to understand what both of you were saying, that investing in the sector averts costs and makes me popular. And at the end of the day, well, it will get me votes, and as SWA's high-level chair, Kevin Rudd, likes to say, well, maybe it will even make me prime minister. So this is, I think that, but it's a question of education and awareness raising, etc. And then there is another thing I would like to add to the difficulties that Stefan was mentioning. Before chairing SWA, I was the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to water and sanitation. And I remember going to an African country, a sub-Saharan African country, and asking, but why don't you invest more in the sector with all the benefits? It seems so logical. And then a member of the government, a minister, was telling me, well, the problem is when you inaugurate a new school, you can cut a ribbon and you see the school. But things related to water and sanitation not only are not sexy, but they are all buried under the ground. You don't see them, then you don't get votes for them, and the results are a bit indirect. So I think it has a lot to do with education and education and education, and I think this is, and like you were saying, Lars, bringing the different stakeholders and the different interests around the same table. Thank you.
Okay, well, Lisa, let's bring you in on this. We haven't, obviously what we've been looking at so far is basically fresh water, which takes up a very small amount of the water on the planet. You are involved with oceans, and at the recent conference on oceans, I think, which Peter Thompson mentioned in his statement at the opening of World Water Week. It was a high-level ministerial conference, heads of state, finance ministers. So, I mean, like Katarina was saying, it's great to get those people around, right? But you seem to have it better off than the freshwater guys in that they seem to be paying more attention to oceans, I suppose because there is less transboundary disputes to worry about, I suppose, with oceans than there is with a transboundary river. How important has it been to have those ministers and those heads of states pay attention to your part of the world?
I'm not sure if I agree with you at all.
Good.
Because I think the background to that ocean conference was also to harbor, of course, who's dealing with the ocean. Because in the UN, and I think the ocean people, because we also have to acknowledge that the freshwater and the ocean community is quite separated. And I think one of the first action points to sort of moving into the water is to see that water is also salt and fresh. And yes, saltwater ocean is 98% of all the water on the earth. And I think that's important to do that linkages. Still, the communities is very separated. And in the ocean community, it's often said that we are 40 years behind the climate change. And that freshwater had really got their acts together with the UN water and moved ahead. But the background for that conference in New York, and there's always a lot of conferences, but the high-level conference in New York on the ocean was, of course, to harbor the ocean goal, which UN does not yet have or is working on. And I think the background for that was because we need to find a solution to solve the problem with the ocean in terms of the energy, the food security, and all the benefits that ocean provides, including water. And that is still not yet happening. So that was the whole background. And I think if you just look at that picture, coming back to the connection to the water and the climate change, is the shark that was mentioned, and the teeth of the shark is the water. We also have to remind ourselves that that shark lives in the ocean. And climate change, ocean is one side of the coin, it's often said, of climate change. And the other side is that ocean is stabilizing factor on the climate change. So if we are not keeping the ocean resilient, then we are also impacting the climate change, which is, of course, a driving change of the whole water and the effects of what we see in changes. And I think the major point in all this is, of course, that we're having more technology and more competence to go out for the resources in the ocean, such as food security and energy security. And that's also where we find most economic driving force. They talk about ocean being an industry of $3 trillion in the years to come. And that is, of course, we need to have food. And why protein from fish and aquaculture comes from the ocean, it will put less demand on water resources from the agriculture on the land. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to have a debate on how this all interlinked it much more closely so people understand why we see this connection. And in the ocean conference in New York, I think there was mostly ocean related. There was some freshwater, but it was not much about freshwater. But then in the end, you talk about land-based pollution. We talk about land-based pollution when we talk about ocean, but ocean doesn't have pollution in itself. It all comes from land. And we talk about wastewater, nutrients, fertilizations, overload, and that is all the connection with the coastal area. So the land-ocean connection, it meets in the coastal area. And my final point at this point is, of course, that you mentioned that we already have our clear borders in the ocean. And I would say that is, yes, we do have UNCLOS, which is the UN Convention Law of the Seas, which is setting up the borders. But one of the biggest challenges with the ocean in moving ahead, and that links to the freshwater and the land, is how do we collaborate? And this is all links into the word this year's Lawrence in Prize, for the prize water, is that peaceful management and resources of water is crucial. But that also links into the ocean and marine spatial planning. How do we collaborate around those resources? Not only in the ocean, but also how do we use the land and the coastal area for fisheries, for aquaculture, for wind power, for tourism. And that is, of course, also linked into the wastewater. You don't want to have a wastewater, either plant or an aquaculture, if you're having a tourism infrastructure in the coastal area. So there is a lot of linkages, and I think the human brain is not set to see those barriers yet.
And that brings up an interesting point that the President also mentioned, I know has been talked about elsewhere at the conference this week, which is, how do you deal with the fact that the UN doesn't seem to have a great deal of teeth, or at least, should I say, unified teeth on water? So, as the President was saying, there are 28 different panels or committees on water. If you are going to set good, resilient, stable policy for water, doesn't it start with something more than the high-level panel for water, which has, what, a 2-year mandate, and it issues a report at the end of it? And I think even the president was, I mean, I thought I was going to be the one being critical of it, but the president was pretty critical, probably more than I would be. Basically, once that 2 years is up, what happens next? There is no real official push, it seems, from a guiding, governing body. Lars, what do you think happens next, and what should we need? Apart from obviously putting the president in charge of everything. From what he was saying, I think he's probably the man for the job. But
no, I think he was right in saying that there is a kind of institutional gap here within the United Nations, and that comes also when we talk more generally about climate change and the climate change related risks, or the risks that follows from climate change. You know, who would take that into account? Who would do the necessary analysis of the risk that follows from climate change? And Sweden now being a member of the Security Council for this year and next year, it's something we have been pushing for, now saying that we have identified this institutional gap and it needs to be addressed now. This is something we are in discussion with the UN Secretary General and the Secretariat, but we believe that there's a real demand for better analytical, to build analytical capacity. And of course, climate and scarcity of water, scarcity of water is a critical element when we talk about climate changes here. And then the reference here to the Lake Chad basin is such an example. But that's also an example where the Security Council in March took a decision saying that we need to build a better understanding of what's happening here and to have strategies explicitly relating to the climate changes.
Right.
Thank you.
Now, you all wanted to follow up. Let's start with you, Lisa. What's your comment on that?
Thanks. I do think that yes, UN is of course crucially important, but we also have to see outside the UN context. And I think the new way of moving into solving problems and finding partnership is also touching up on one of the other goals in the SDG agenda, which is the partnership and using the private sector. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are in the UN family, working also in the UN. We are not going to solve the problem ourselves. And I don't know, multi-stakeholder platforms, etc. That's very good, but we also have to engage with the private sector. And just to give you one example, a company that we work with, they have more competence in one of the areas that we work with than we do in-house. And they have it because they need it and they see the benefits of having that competence themselves. So we could also collaborate and partner with them to draw upon their resources.
And you're talking about that as more in a policy and governance area that they seem strong, or in finance or something else?
No, I am talking about both in policy development, but particularly rather from moving to the broad policy instrument, because we do have that in place with the SDGs that we have negotiated all around the world with all the countries. They have agreed upon this framework. We have now the framework where we aim to do. The point is now moving in, how do we implement this? And who's going to find the solution? So this is where I think the UN has done a framework. We now need to build partnership with the private sector that had the dynamic and creative thoughts about how to find the solutions, the implementations, and then moving into the very regional, working with the people on the ground. And then you get the financing into it. But I think the challenge is to see this global level to a very concrete local level for the implementation.
Right. Stefan, you wanted to make a comment, and then Katarina.
Probably many of us agree that the UN doesn't have many teeth. There are many sharks sometimes, I need to say. When it comes to the SDGs, you know, we know there's next summer in mid-July there will be the high-level political forum looking at where are we with SDG 6, among others, 7 energy and 3 others. And to inform that process, for a change, the UN really, like the UN water community, got the act together to some extent. And let me briefly report on what we are doing is we are preparing a so-called synthesis report on SDG 6. To inform the high-level political forum, of course, every agency kind of holding the flag of one of the indicators or targets, you could like yet another report, and like having throwing many reports into a meeting does not necessarily increase the impact of that. So we decided, no, one report, not yet another one from each of the agencies, but one consolidated one, comprehensive report, SDG 6 synthesis report, where we try to summarize where are we with SDG 6, what is the status in terms of the indicator, the numerical values, and some world maps, some are green and some are red, and look at that as a picture. But also, what are the interlinkages? I think President Adler and also you just summarized the critical links water has to many other targets. And how do we quantify that? So at this very moment, we do a lot of statistical analysis and look at how does water indicators, how do they actually numerically link with others? Is that helping us interpreting that? Results are somehow mixed, I need to honestly say. Sometimes, for instance, the WASH indicators, they are highly linked to health. So no big surprise, having better water supply, better sanitation is positively correlated with, for instance, child mortality for children under 5. Everybody probably agrees that makes sense. On the other hand, in our last year World Water Development Report on water and jobs, we were coming up with the story that if people are more healthy, if they have better water supply and sanitation, they are more kind of productive. They can be healthy, go to work, and it increases the efficiency. But if you look at the WASH indicators and look and correlate them with the GDP, for instance, or with work efficiency, there's a lot of red, meaning that there was no correlation. In some countries, it was actually negatively correlated. So the first order control, despite the fact that water is linked to everything, I agree with that. But there's many others as well. A country's GDP does not only depend on WASH. Katerina, we would like to see that differently, but be honest, in some countries it's the gold price or the oil price and so many other things. So actually quantifying these interlinkages, being able to have effective policy recommendations. Beyond this, we need more political will and we need more capacity and all this. Beyond that, that's a challenge. So that's what we are trying in this synthesis report, as quantitative as possible, but also very much realizing that quantitative analysis is not the only one to advise policymakers on where are we and what do we need to do to actually accelerate achieving this important SDG.
Katerina.
Maybe I will say something that is this working? Yes. Maybe I will say something that is politically incorrect, but it goes very much in line with what Stefan was saying. I believe much more in making sure that we work better together, that the existing institutions work better together. And I think that the example Stefan just gave of the synthesis report for next year is an excellent one. I believe much more in making sure that we do that than rather creating new institutions. And I think that it's like with human relationships. You have problems with your husband, your wife, well, you can get divorced and get a new one, or you can try to fix the problem. And I believe more in trying to fix the problem and working better together and better deepening the relationships, coordinating better, assessing where are our gaps, where are our overlaps, what do we need to do, rather than just creating new institutions. That's my personal opinion. And I think, like Lisa was saying, that we should go much more in the direction of what the SDGs tell us. I think that it is much more relevant for the world we live in to focus on partnerships. Partnerships between governments, yes, but not only governments. And we need to give, and this is something the UN does not allow for, when it comes to intergovernmental bodies, I think we need to put them at the same level. The civil society and the governments and the private sector and the financial institutions and the research institutions, because we were talking about the need for technology, we have to have partnerships, multi-stakeholder partnerships that put the partners at the same level, that try to find not only solutions in global discussions, but then very importantly, as I think both of you said, that then make sure that the people who are in the global discussions are the same, that are working on these issues at the national level. Because if you have somebody in New York, a wonderful diplomat as you, Lars, attending a meeting in New York, but, what I mean to say is that, sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot. No, that's not what I meant to say. I wanted to say something nice. Okay, so forget that. So, I think that it's not enough to have a diplomat in New York negotiating something. It has to be the people who in the countries are responsible for policy making that have to participate in the global discussions. You cannot have this divorce that we have right now, that you have a diplomat in New York, I'm being very blunt, who reads at 10 a.m. a statement about terrorism and in the afternoon goes to another meeting and reads a statement that comes from the capital about water and sanitation. No, we need the people from the ground, the people who have decision-making power, the director generals, the NGO people, coming to these meetings. And maybe the EU... Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, let's... So, much as I hate to put it down to sound bites, the good water policy is like marriage, is going to stick with me for a very long time. But actually, I mean, where you're going with that is actually where the next question was coming from my point of view, which is, so I started off trying to work out, okay, at the international level, is there good policy changes we can make? But actually, you're right, it is at the national level. And so, since the SDGs came out, since the Paris Climate Accord was signed, have these been used by countries as a way to boost what, say, the Minister of Water wants to do within a country? Have just the pure fact that these now exist, have those provided a spur to various countries to action? Lars, you were mentioning you had some examples earlier on. Maybe you're the person to start off with on this. How just since these goals have come out, what have we seen happening on a positive side?
Thank you. If I very briefly look at the way, first of all, just there is no misunderstanding. We are not asking for any new institutions, no, definitely not. But we think there is a gap in terms of understanding the climate risks and what it could follow in terms of threats to international security. Now, positive examples, yes. My own country, we have a number of rivers starting up there, going down through the Baltic Sea now. We are now moving to a fossil-free economy, which means we are looking to the hydro, more so. So we have Water Council, or the government agency responsible for sea and water. They have established a number of water councils, bringing together local and regional stakeholders who represent different interests. Environmental groups, the utilities, or the power utilities, the municipalities. And all this is meant to foster local engagement and a comprehensive approach to it. We have the Baltic HELCOM, it's called, which means a cooperation between the Baltic states, where we have, over the past 20 years after the fall of the wall, collaborated with the different countries, meaning that we have now more or less made sure that there is water treatment plants in all the major cities discharging into the Baltic Sea. My previous job was in Zimbabwe. We have an excellent collaboration there between Zimbabwe and Zambia on the Zambezi River Authority on how to regulate hydropower and also environmental concerns now. So I think there is a number of then we have the Copernicus research on how to forecast the changes that climate change will bring in terms of the rivers and the flow of the rivers, whether they will increase or decrease. There is a lot of collaboration. I want to say something on finance now. How to,
Please do. I'm happy to hear it.
And that is, I think there is a strong case that climate-compatible policies, and that definitely includes investment in water, is good for economic growth. And there was an OECD study coming out in May, investing in climate, investing in growth, which exactly makes this case. That if you are interested in economic growth, you should invest in climate. No? And there is underinvestment now in our infrastructure throughout the world. That you have financial space because of low interest rates and the like. So this is the case to invest in this transition, because it will bring higher economic growth in the future and better growth. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to plug my own work, I once read a piece last year saying climate change was the investment deal of the century for precisely the reasons you've laid out. So it's just getting people to get there. Katarina, you were going to
yes, I just wanted to say on the question that you asked on the positive examples, and I have to say I discovered yesterday that 17 years ago Lars and I were working together in the area of human rights, and when I was special rapporteur, I published a book compiling good practices in the area of water and sanitation, including in the area of climate change. There is a lot being done. When I think of our SWA partners, and the Secretary of State of Morocco was here, I think that what they are doing is amazing at the national level in terms of, well, dealing with water scarcity and water scarcity, reuse of water, etc. And what I saw, and I was telling her, which is amazing in one of our meetings that she attended, was the fact that it's the exchange of good practices. And having ministers, because we do ministerial roundtables, we do less plenaries, more ministerial roundtables, and I remember the huge interest of sub-Saharan African countries and other countries even in Latin America and in Asia, listening to her, to the things that she was saying, and then exchanging business cards and saying, we have to stay in touch because we have to learn from what you are doing, for example, in Morocco, in terms of desalination, etc. So I think there are lots of examples. We have just to come together, and this is what we do here during this week also.
Before we go to the last couple of questions, we did talk about inclusion and getting all stakeholders involved. That includes you. If you have any questions, now is the time to raise your hand. I should have asked a few minutes ago. I'm going to do a quick scan now, then come back to you in a second. Okay, so I mean, let's stick on the topic of well, the one I just raised. So inclusion and accountability. A couple of the events I've been to this week, there was a particular individual whose name I didn't get, who basically said, okay, so I'm hearing NGOs, governments, and corporations coming together to talk about what's needed to be done. He said, aren't we at risk of looking as if these big three institutions are colluding if we do not show to the people this affects, men and women on the street, that they're getting absolute benefits from this? Now, each of you has kind of mentioned some of this already, but Lisa, let me put this on to you. How do we show that whatever policies are put in place or utilized are helping people enough so it doesn't just look as if it is yet another boondoggle between corporations, NGOs, and governments?
Well, I do think that, as I was touched upon before, governments has a certain role, of course, in institutions, because they are accountable to the people that are hopefully in a democracy elected to them. But I also think it's the laws and implementations, but also the enforcement, and how do you make that happen? And I think you have to make it very civil, what do you call it, public scrutiny. And I think this is why the importance of the NGO and the civil society is crucial, and that is, of course, the whole basis of a healthy democracy. Because if you put pressure, we work with peer pressure, put it in the light, you could put pressure and create a race to the top. And that pressure will move, hopefully, the healthy politicians to act on it. And I think this is why when policies are inside a room, negotiated by diplomats, or as you said in New York, it becomes a very hostile, closed environment where the accountability and the civil scrutiny is not there yet. And I think one of the Swedish, since I am a Swede, one of the key points in the whole security debate was that the transparency of the decisions and the discussions and dialogue in the security room going on, also informing the community outside what's happening. So I think this connection is crucial. And how do you do that? There is tremendous opportunity with the new technology, sitting and following what's already going on, but also spreading to the world that people do not have access, that people cannot travel to New York to participate in a meeting, or even not having the capacity to understand what it means. You can still send out messages and have that translated to communities, all over the world at the same moment as that happens. So this is a tremendous force, and I think UN, and as I said, working with the private sector that had the more dynamic thinking and actually moving ahead with a decision today that could affect tomorrow. That would be one of the crucial barriers to even be able to reach some of the goals. And the last point would be in the 14 goal on ocean. We are supposed to reach some of their targets already 2020. And here we're sitting, still discussing.
Let's pass this down. Any other comments on accountability? Go on, you know you want to.
Oh, I want it. No, well, accountability is a fundamental human rights principle. And, well, water and sanitation have been recognized as human rights. Also, there are human rights obligations regarding to the protection of the environment. And what I can... but it all relates to what you were saying, Lisa, I think. Having strong systems in place at the national level. And of course, it's fundamental to have strong civil society organizations. I remember as special rapporteur going to countries like the US, where you have a tremendous, fantastic civil society holding the government to account, and then things move. Well, sometimes there are elections and then there are problems. But
some of us still have faith,
yes.
Long-term faith.
But then you have other countries where the civil society is not that empowered and you have a problem. And I think, again, I think that I believe very much in partnerships at a global level that then replicate this model at the national level, bringing everyone together, and this helps. And I think this is the solution for the present and for the future. It's the multi-stakeholder dimension at the global level, and then ensuring that it exists in every single country, and that we empower civil society, and that we teach. I remember going to Egypt and visiting a project supported by the European Commission of a non-governmental organization, an Egyptian one, that was financed by the EU in order to teach the people in the slum how to claim their rights. That's what they were doing. They were knocking on doors and telling them, you have a human right to water. So this is the departments you have to go to claim your rights. So this is the type of action that we need in order to make sure that governments and others are held accountable, also the private sector, etc., etc.
Okay, final point and last word to Lisa. We've run out of time. If you do have questions, do come up afterwards. Sorry, I've allowed the panelists to dominate, which is kind of what they're here for.
Sorry, Lisa. I just wanted to emphasize that. Once upon a life, I was a trade negotiator, and doing trade in environments. And as an EU position, you had a civil society mechanism, a scrutiny. But the countries that we negotiated with at that time rather wanted to have a legal instrument because they thought that would be less important for them.
Okay. Excellent. Well, let's leave it there. Please, by all means, come up. But for now, I'd like to thank our panelists, and hopefully we have mixed in a little bit of depression with a fair amount of good news. Thanks all for joining us.
Of ground and a lot of water in such a short time. And Anthony, Lisa, Stefan, Katarina, and Lars. Now, we need a break, I guess, after this. And but before the break, I would like to invite Fred Bolts, Managing Director for Rockefeller Foundation, to join me on the stage. This is an event co-hosted by Rockefeller Foundation and SIWI, and we will be back at 11 a.m. for next session, and you will lead us through. What will be up at 11?
Yes, please come back. Bring your friends. 11, we start off a session with some of the world's preeminent leaders in science, engineering, financing, business investment, and practice. We transition from policy discussion to state-of-the-art in science and practice, so come on back and bring your friends. Colleagues and dear friends, excellencies, honorable ministers, ambassadors, laureates, excellent friends and colleagues of the water community, good morning. Welcome to the second half of Building a Resilient Future Through Water, SIWI's signature event taking stock of progress on the science, policy, and practice necessary to fulfill our global aspirations for sustainable development and climate security as embodied in the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, and resilience as an appropriate lens for that urgent endeavor. It's an honor for the Rockefeller Foundation to co-convene this important dialogue, which represents an annual multi-stakeholder stocktaking or review of progress and pledges to advancing that development agenda. The rich dialogue that Torgny chaired this morning highlighted relevant policy, financing, and partnerships that are vital to our collective efforts. Now we turn to the science and practice required to understand and to effectively address the complexity of navigating a changing world amidst compounding forces of human growth and globalization, dramatic shifts in climate and other Earth system functions, surprise, and uncertainty. I can think of no better speaker to articulate the science required to embrace and address such complexity than my good friend, Professor Johan Rockström, Executive Director of the Stockholm Resilience Center. Please join me in welcoming him.
Wonderful. Thanks, Fred, and wonderful to have this opportunity to address a really important session on advancing the whole paradigm on water resilience as a lens for development in the Anthropocene. And I'd like to just start off by making clear that science is now well established. Earth system science, with major advancements over the last 30 years, has shown unequivocally that we have now entered a whole new geological epoch, the Anthropocene, anthros for us humans, that we are now no longer a small world on a big planet. We are now the dominant force of change determining the whole equilibrium or stability domain, the resilience of the entire Earth system. This is based on observations and evidence of the great acceleration and the exponential rise of pressures over the last 50 years. It's based on the advancements of complex adaptive systems research showing how different components of the Earth system, from the biosphere to the climate systems to the stratosphere to the entire hydrological cycle, interact and is a self-regulating system. It's based on the observations that Earth has such high degree of resilience that it has actually been our best friend, absorbing stress and shocks over the entire Industrial Revolution, expressed through the 95% of heat from greenhouse gas emissions stored in the oceans, 25% of carbon dioxide on terrestrial ecosystems, and another 25% in oceans. And science has then translated all these diagnostic insights into the framework of planetary boundaries, which you see the slide here, which is the effort of trying scientifically to define what are the Earth system processes that regulates the stability of the Earth system and its ability to support humanity. And secondly, can we quantify scientifically what are the quantitative boundaries within which we have a stable, safe operating space and beyond which we risk crossing thresholds when we lose resilience that could take us irreversibly and abruptly into a trajectory that we no longer can control. 9 boundaries have been identified. They have been scrutinized by the scientific community over the past 8 years. And we land today in a high degree of confidence that if we are planetary stewards of these 9, we stand a good chance of having world development within a stable and resilient Earth system. Water is one of the 9. No surprise to us, but that is as far as we've come today. So what does water resilience then mean in terms of a lens for development in the future? Well, it really comes out of the recognition that we are facing, with very high degree of scientific evidence, Earth system tipping points, which are now across the entire Earth system. This is a map that has been synthesized on the published literature on what are the abrupt, potentially catastrophic tipping points we may be facing. And you see, of course, the climate-induced tipping points from Greenland, Arctic sea ice, West Antarctic ice shelf. You've certainly read about the Larsen B glaciers, but look carefully at this map and you see the Amazon rainforest and the risk of tipping over into savanna state. You see the Southeast Asian monsoon systems. You see the African monsoon systems. You see the temperate boreal forests. And all of these systems are clearly now documented as being predominantly driven by temperature rise and climate change, but increasingly also evidence showing that water can play a role in inducing tipping points and potentially pushing systems across thresholds. We have increasing scientific evidence that these systems are moreover connected to each other, that if we would, at 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warming, shown in the yellow systems here, if they would be crossing tipping points, being pushed across tipping points, that they can have teleconnections influencing the systems in orange here that could then tip over at 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, and the dark red ultimately being pushed at 5 degrees Celsius. So what we could envisage is we emit greenhouse gases through fossil fuel burning, tipping over the Greenland ice sheet and the Arctic summer ice, having teleconnections that would hit back on the Amazon rainforest and its moisture feedback, which in turn is a water-induced tipping point towards savannas, unleashing even more carbon, which could self-propel into an uncontrolled future for the stability of the Earth system. So increasing evidence that water resilience matters at the planetary scale. The way we define resilience is fundamentally the capacity of a system, be it social or ecological, or social-ecological as we define it in the integrated Earth system state we are today, to continually change and adapt, yet remain within critical thresholds, remain in a desired state. Now, we have three elements of resilience when we analyze this scientifically. The first is persistence, the ability to take stress while still remain and coping with that stress, like a drought, a flood, or a financial system coping with a sudden shock. The second feature of resilience is adaptability. You stay in one domain as a small-scale farming community or a fishing community or an urban system, and what's the ability to take stresses while remaining and navigating within your desired state, your ability to navigate change while remaining in a desired trajectory. And finally, the ability to transform, that once you're pushed across, for example, landing in a poverty trap or fundamentally having to decarbonize a whole society, what's our ability and what is the agency we need to be able to cross thresholds and move into a completely new domain or stability equilibrium? So this is the wide thinking on resilience today. Now, water resilience we've recently defined as follows, as the ability and the role of water in determining the state of a social ecological system, its ability to generate ecosystem functions and services, and its ability to build capacity to deal with shocks and stress and adapt to changing conditions. So what role does water play in building resilience? And we've identified three key factors or features of water. The first one being water as a control variable, water regulating moisture feedback and therefore rainfall in future time steps. The role of water to generate ecosystem functions, the recognition that green and blue water is fundamental to keep habitats, ecosystems, landscapes operating, like, for example, carbon sequestration. The role of water as a state variable, meaning how much water do we need as a minimum wetness in landscapes to keep environmental water flows functioning, or the blue water requirements in groundwater lakes to supply to society, or the green water wetness we need as a minimum of vapor flow to keep ecosystems functioning as a state variable. And finally, water as a driving variable. What role does water shocks play in tipping over, for example, social dynamics we see and read in the papers today of flooding in airports I just saw in Mexico City, but all the way to Hurricane Harvey and its influence on social driver of conflict. So this is features of water resilience that shows us an integrating lens for development. I just want to dig down a little bit into the role of water in sustaining desired states of big biomes that support societal development, from food to biomass and energy. This is the classic work from Lvovich from 1979, who already then recognized the fact that water determines the state of different biomes in the Earth system. That on the x-axis here, the degree of wetting, he defined this as both wetting in terms of runoff generation, which is the lower curve. As you see, up to around 1,000 millimeters of wetting, there's basically no runoff in big biomes, and then runoff starts increasing. And the upper curve is the green water flow, that you have a high degree of green water at dry ecosystems, and then it levels off as canopies cover increasingly and runoff flows increases. But the key here is that we have three different states, and that these states are separated by water thresholds, that wet savannas has a range of wetting, and if you push a system down the wetting range, meaning that you dry the system, that you can push the system over a tipping point, taking it to a dry savanna state. And you continue having shocks and stress, like, for example, droughts and dry spells, pushing the system into an arid, degraded state. And the big questions, of course, is where are these thresholds? And this is the scientific front. And also the big question, is there hysteresis in this? Meaning that we are at risk of losing quicker than our ability to invest back a system. So we may be at high risk of losing rainforest into savanna state, and we may be entirely unable to push the system back from a savanna to a rainfall state. There's been a lot of research in this area. This is a seminal paper by Marina Hirota et al. Showing on the left-hand system evidence that yes, systems have thresholds, water resilience thresholds between treeless, savanna, and forest states. So depending on where you are in your wetness in landscapes, you are at risk of tipping systems across tipping points. And on the right hand, you have the evidence showing on the y-axis the degree of tree cover in percentage from 0 to 100, and on the x-axis, rainfall. And what you see is clouds here showing clearly equilibrium domains that you are likely to lose tree cover, which is the fundamental part of carbon sequestration in the terrestrial biosphere, when you lose water. So water is definitely a driver and determinant of the equilibrium state of different ecosystems. But this is only the diagnostic of the static state. We're right now working, and the following slides are unpublished, on asking the question, but what if we change water? What if we push water into a stress point through climate change, unsustainable water management, combined with land use change? And we haven't really concluded this yet, but we have some indications. The left graph is equivalent to the previous slide, showing on the x-axis degree of wetting, meaning how much green water do you have in the soil, and you see from 0 to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 millimeters. And on the y-axis, tree cover in percentage from 0 to 100. And you have these two green-gray spots here showing the savanna region between 0 and 1,000 millimeters of wetness, and the humid forest states above 1,000. Stable state, stable equilibria. This is, let's say, our desired state for human well-being, the resilient state. But if we load this with land use change observed over the past 50 years, plus RCP 8.5, which is the climate, let's say the business as usual trajectory on climate change, which leads to up to 25% change in wetness in particularly semi-arid tropical regions, we end up with this very messy picture, where suddenly the stability domain of our stable forest systems basically collapses, and you see a spread of the systems across a whole range of, let's say, unstable domain in the middle. And the question is, where do they fall? Do they fall into a savanna state or arid, totally desertified state? And what are the predicaments, and how can we manage to build resilience to maintain and avoid these kind of trajectories? This, again, is ongoing unpublished research, but just as an indication that water resilience, through our stewardship of river basins and landscapes, seem to matter very much. We also have the first indications, as you know, that this might lead to social conflict. The indications, this is a seminal paper showing statistically that when rainfall moves more than one standard deviation away from average, we risk a 14% increase in intergroup conflict. That we can no longer say that the Arab Spring or the Sudanese refugee crisis or risks in terms of instability in semi-arid, particularly semi-arid regions in the world, are decoupled from water and thereby global environmental change. That what you see on the graph here is that when rainfall deviates over 10–20% of the annual average, we increase the risk of conflict significantly. And this is based on 60+ case studies around the world. So even though we can never say that water drives conflict, we can, on the other hand, never say that water is not coupled to conflict. And this is the state of science today. So conceptually, we've put it forward in the following way. This is what we believe scientifically today is the conceptual framework, understanding that rainfall is the determinant of resilience in the water domain. We manage rainfall, and it goes through human activities, water partitioning, ecosystem services. We have the anthropogenic, let's say, stewardship component. This leads to water alterations of runoff flows and evapotranspiration flows, and that these green and blue flows are coupled to dynamic feedbacks that then determines rainfall in the next time step. So we want to maintain this water resilience paradigm right through this anthropogenic stewardship of rainfall. And that we have evidence that this matters. You may have seen this, what I would argue, potentially a geopolitical hydro bomb, showing in red the regions where moisture feedback from upstream ecosystems, meaning forest systems, determine 80% or more, that's the red regions, 80% or more of rainfall. So look at China here, with the Yellow River and the dry regions in China that depend to 80% or more, this is what the science indicates, from moisture feedback from upstream regions all the way to Ukraine, Russia, whole Central Europe. So China depends on water resilience building in Central Europe. Latin America depends on upstream management of the Amazon rainforest. The whole red region in Africa depends on also not only ocean moisture feedback, but also then the management of ecosystems on land. So this is the water resilience element at the larger scale. We've just published a book on water resilience for human prosperity showing that we have indications in the circles here of water-related tipping points in different biomes. And as you see from these circles, they go across from the Amazon rainforest to savanna systems to salinization systems in different landscape biomes. So it is a really important factor, and it's related to the fact that we now know that also water is in the Anthropocene. This has been well published. To the left you have the pre-industrial partitioning of green and blue water at the global hydrological cycle and the quantifications of green water to sustain different natural biomes as the pristine reference point. And to the right we have the estimates of what we've done in the Anthropocene, with the major changes and shifts on pastures, cropland, irrigation, the deviation of blue water becoming green water. To be honest, we don't know what these shifts in the global hydrological cycle really has as fundamental elements of influence on the state of the planet, but we increasingly have indications that more green water leads to more climate forcing, that more shifts in water partitioning can destabilize resilience in biomes, and that this in turn can have knock-on effects on social development. So again, water resilience as a lens. And to close, just one little deep dive then on practical terms. So we have the Sustainable Development Goals. The big challenge on water is water for food. One hotspot area is clearly sub-Saharan Africa, the most, on average, dry continent on the planet, with the most rapid population growth and dietary requirements. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting that water resilience is a key factor to be able to unleash a new green water revolution in Africa, to be able to feed a rapidly growing African population. This diagram in this publication we published in Science quite recently shows just the arid and semi-arid population growth, which is the region with the largest water resilience requirements, will add up to over 1 billion African citizens by 2050. So 1 billion African citizens in regions where water resilience will have to be a lens for development. So it just shows what a predicament we're facing, that the Sustainable Development Goals, to put it simple, can, with a very high likelihood, not be accomplished without having a water resilience entry point across the goals with a specific focus on goals 1 and 2. And that scientifically we argue today that these 17 goals is not a Swedish smorgasbord where you pick what you like. They should be taken as a seminal aspirational wedding cake where the biosphere is the base, where the goals on freshwater, climate, biodiversity, and oceans form the safe operating space, the planetary boundaries upon which we can build resilience to achieve social and economic goals as set out by the Sustainable Development Goals. So I would argue as a closing, Fred, that yes, there is scientific evidence that water resilience is a key lens for global sustainable development in the Anthropocene. That's why this session is so important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, An. True genius in your ability to systematically approach, research, and analyze and articulate a vision for addressing such complexity, which so many of us find confounding as we approach a changing planet and 17 interlinked and interdependent sustainable development goals. Next, we transition from the science underpinning that response to advances in applying that science to diagnosing and designing for water resilience, with a particular feature on Mexico City, the megalopolis, and the Valley of Mexico that sustains it, that is a key input to the freshwater security and resilience of that region. I'd like to invite Professor Casey Brown of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, head of the Hydrosystems Lab at that fine university, and Fernando Gonzalez, who is director of the Water Management Agency of Cutzamala, the Valley of Mexico, that is furnishing about 1/3 of the water supply to Mexico City, to join me on stage. Please come on up. Yeah, and you can use the clicker. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
You bet. So we're going to get the audience progressively accustomed to the panel by sitting here for the presentation. Over
Very
to you,
good.
Casey.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about our work today. First, let me say that I'm an engineering professor, and so I am inspired by the presentation that we just saw, and especially by the challenge of taking those concepts and what we're learning from the science and applying them in practical on-the-ground projects with an engineering challenge and constraint of thinking about budgets and thinking about explaining it to people and having them believe that this is something that's worth investing in. And so I'll share with you a bit of the challenge and the struggle and how we're approaching this problem today. We are calling this freshwater resilience by design. And we think what is distinctive about it is for the first time, we're putting design as a design objective, resilience as a direct design objective within our work. Too long, I think the engineering world, especially within the water world, we have been dominated by the goal to provide one objective while minimizing cost. And that is resulting in fragile systems. And we look around the world today and we see the consequences of living with these fragile systems. An example of this, that these are directly from the recent Hurricane Harvey hitting Houston. What we see here are engineering systems that are failing exactly as they're designed to fail. This is how we design it. This is how it's supposed to happen. It's a stormwater system. Houston has had stormwater challenges for a long time. They've known about it. And they've designed their system to handle storms of a certain magnitude. And when they get storms of that magnitude, they perform very well. When they get storms greater than that magnitude, then they fail. And they fail by pushing that water somewhere else, and somewhere that water collects. And it collects in places like this, low points, of course, and places where you can excuse humans, really, for having a failure of imagination. We have a failure of imagination in terms of a little stream or a little puddle can one day be a river running down your road or down your highway and through your city. This is a challenge that we face. It's really, as I say, we should excuse humans because hydrology is highly nonlinear. And so on average, with small storms, it's not a problem. But every once in a while, and it really is every once in a while, every 100 years, every 50 years, then we're hit with the magnitude of events that our systems cannot handle. And then the question is, how do they fail? And what happens when they fail? This is the challenge. It's becoming more of a challenge, especially for me as an engineer, because we, as probably you, we like a single vision of the world. I want a single design storm, a magnitude that I can plan for. But the problem is, and this is the problem in Houston as well, not just related to climate change, but the rapidly changing land use that's taking place with any large growing city, is that the world, we're better understanding just how complicated the world is. And so if we look at any one particular place, although we agree that climate models are very helpful for us to make decisions about whether we should mitigate against carbon emissions or not, when we actually try to do a design at any particular place, then we face this challenge of which of the futures should we plan for, because there are many possibilities. And it's just not the way that we think about design. As an engineer, this is not how we were brought up to do business. And what's interesting, I think, is this learning from the science and learning how they're thinking about resilience, largely coming from their understanding of ecosystems. Can we learn and apply some of those principles within our designs? Now, as an engineer, one of the interesting things about resilience that I found is that there are almost as many definitions of resilience as there are futures to consider. And so it's been difficult to try to draw it down from an engineering perspective, from a reductive perspective, so we can put that concept into practice. And it's been interesting. What I found is that if you have two scientists within a room, then you'll have three definitions of resilience. If you have two engineers in the room, you have none. And so our goal now is to try to link these communities a little bit better. And so we've tried to draw some of the commonalities. These are just an example, a sample of the definitions that are out there. One thing is it's the ability of a system. So let's recognize right away it's not directly observable. It's a theoretical construct. Thus, measurement of resilience is entirely dependent on how we define it. The definition is important. I would argue there is no perfect definition. The definition that is perfect is the one that your partners adopt to evaluate their particular design. But certainly it's the ability of the system. It's a focus on shocks, disturbances, and stresses. We're no longer, and in particular why this is different is because we're not talking about long-term averages anymore. It's these short events, it's these episodic events that happen rarely. And so how does our system respond to those? Often in design, those have little significance because they are so rare. So the economic consequences are often easily ignored. And then finally, it is the qualities. What are we going to do with that event? You'll hear recovery and you'll hear maintain the ability to perform. And so if we narrow that down, and we call this performance-based resilience, so rather than the theory of how we get resilience, what does it look like when we have it? This is what performance-based resilience is. So we're looking for designs that perform well over a wide range of futures, that are able to recover after failure, and that have the ability to transform to new configurations if that's needed. So that's very consistent with the definitions that we've seen, but we feel defined in a way that we can actually measure it, which is what we need to do to evaluate it in design. How are we doing this? We call it resilience by design. 3 transformative ways to doing design for water infrastructure. We think these ways, these methods have been out there before. They're within the academic world. Can we put them into practice and can we show that they have value? This is what we're trying to achieve. So moving from a single objective world to a multiple objective world where resilience is one of those objectives and where economic and service objectives are just part of it. But of course, we're considering social and equity and environmental objectives as well. Certainly we've heard those phrases before, but what does it actually mean in terms of the resilience of those systems and putting it into the practice of engineering design as the future? Probably the most important thing is now evaluating our designs not just from a single best guess of what the future might be, but a wide range of multiple futures. Realizing that as humans, we are limited in our imagination to consider and really think about what the world could offer us in the future. So let's not make best guesses. Let's try every possibility and understanding where the vulnerabilities are. We can rule them out later as being highly unlikely, but first let's understand what they are. And finally, thinking carefully in terms of multiple projects instead of single projects. One of the great issues with Houston, in addition to the fact that they have rapid land use change, is that, and this is the way we do it, every one of those stormwater systems is designed by itself. So you put in a new culvert and you design it for that space. And you put one over here and you design it for that space. Not thinking what happens when you get that low probability but high impact event and they all fail together. So resilience by design, I should say it's powered. Why are we not doing this already is a question. Part of it is a change in mindset. Part of it is that we didn't have the tools to do it. It was very difficult in our design approaches to consider thousands of futures. We can do that now largely because of our computational ability and how it's grown so quickly. So the process has 4 steps as we define it. First, we design our resilience and scope. That necessarily begins with a deep dive with our partners and stakeholders, and we discuss the future states of the world that we'll consider and possible options to evaluate. We build it into a model. We can't do tests like this in the real world, so we create virtual worlds and do thousands of features within those virtual worlds and try thousands of combinations of different investments. We then use special tools to search through those results to find the best possible investments and work with our partners to develop an implementation plan. I want to point out that this hasn't just come from the back of an envelope after a very inspirational week. No, we've been working on this for quite a long time. We weren't calling it resilience, actually. When we did this study in 2012 on the international, the Great Lakes system, trying to understand how to adapt to climate change, we were stumbling along calling it climate risk. We really weren't sure what we were doing yet. We just knew we had to do things differently. And worked with, amazingly, an engineering system that controls the levels of the world's largest water resources system, the Great Lakes system. We're now expanding that. Even though we were stumbling through, we came up with a reasonable answer, now expanding that to the entire, what's called the International Joint Commission, which manages the boundary waters between the US and Canada. Working with the state of California, working with the World Bank and the development of the decision tree, which is also going through its own evolution from originally just assessing climate risks and now coming up with better designs. An example of that of hydropower, a very different kind of project in Nepal. working with public utilities in the United States, such as Colorado Springs and San Francisco. I'm bringing this up to say that there is action taking place out there. The great challenge that we have is we see Houston on the news when it fails. We don't see San Francisco on the news when it manages a drought perfectly. People don't write articles about that. And we're working really very excited about recent work with partners such as the World Bank, Rockefeller Foundation, and ARIP on thinking through from the beginning. We have this opportunity where we know cities could be the center of action, where they will be making investments in response to climate change. Can we change the way those investments are made so that the resilience is designed in from the start? And this is where I'm happy to ask to join me Fernando Gonzalez, who is from Cutzamala Okavam system, where we are working to try to address this huge problem of, and really it's a major problem, in terms of a sustainable water supply and a resilient water supply for Mexico City. We're developing a tool we call Open Agua, so although it's so lovely to visit Mexico City as much as we can, this tool is a platform on the cloud so that we can dialogue virtually from Amherst, Massachusetts to Mexico City and save on some travel costs. And most importantly, we're now evaluating our designs in terms of real resilience objectives, quantified. And I'll close. I think it's exciting, but possibly only to the engineers in the crowd. On the left is the current system. On the right is what we found to be, bear with me just for a second here. It's a wonderful system. On the left is the current system. On the right is what we have found to be one of the most promising possible investments for improving the performance of that system. And it's not a new dam, and it's not all that much new infrastructure. It's just increasing the connectivity of the system. A few new lines, a little more capacity, increasing the connectivity of the system, and it harkens back to the exact lessons that we learn all the time from the resilience literature. So I think that's the goal of where we'll end up. In conclusion, freshwater resilience requires investment done in new ways. I think there's a significant and important opportunity to re-engineer water infrastructure. That's where we are right now. However, if we evaluate designs, as we always have, we'll choose the designs we've always chosen in the past. And in my experience, that's exactly what we're doing right now. So there is a need for change.
Thank you. Thank you, Casey. Much appreciated. Thank you very much. I actually found that engineering slide quite exciting, but I'm an economist, and it reminded me of my favorite quote about economists, said by a fellow economist, which is, being an economist is like peeing on your leg. It's hot to you, but not to anyone around you. With that, allow me to ask my good friend Fernando Gonzalez of the Water Basin Agency of the Valley of Mexico to join us. Fernando has the extraordinarily daunting mandate of ensuring that the Cutzamala system, which supplies about 30% of Mexico City's water, is not halted for, it must be restored under less than 5 minutes with any interruptions. So that requires that Fernando stays awake at all times of day, 365 days a year, yet he's still smiling about it, healthy, and leading a transition of that water system to embracing resilience at a basin scale that feeds into Mexico City, and really one of the most prominent and preeminent paradigms for that resilience challenge in water management globally. Thank you, Fernando, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much to SIWI. Thank you for Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you, World Bank, too. 5 years ago, we thought that water security for 22 million people was a big challenge. Then we saw that there's 66 different entities and municipalities that have some authority over water or services being rendered to the population, with 9 different political parties, 3 different states and constitutions to mind off. So, and a big problem was that engineers and economists could not speak to each other or do not have a common language to set priority, and especially to say which destination is better for the people's money, which is what we have in our hands when you're in a public office. So, first of all, we have 38% of the GDP depend on this megacity functioning well. As any megacity, we have three basic infrastructure elements, which is water, energy, and mobility, that bring a platform for the city to develop. During the 1960s to the 1980s, we tripled our population. So the great task of bringing safe drinking water to that capital of the country was a mega issue. We built the Kutsamala system in the 1970s. We decided we should build it. We finished building it by 1994, and it's been running since 1982 in its first stage till now, 35 years without failing. The city, even in the worst earthquake that ever happened in that city, which is 8.1 earthquake in 2.5 minutes in duration. So we face a major challenge. We have a very potent and very good aquifer that is responsible for 70% and the main resiliency element that the city has. But in a risk analysis, we found out that the vulnerability of the city relies on its surface water sources, which is the Kutsamala system, basically. The Kutsamala system, it's 6 different watersheds, 7 dams, 6 mega pumping stations that rise water from to basically 1,100 meters up to the valley and 300 kilometers away. We found out that the paradigm and the structure that we were leading towards robustness, redundancy, water security was not enough. So we went beyond that paradigm and we started thinking that water catchment cannot be resilient or sustainable in the future if land use was not in the plan. And land use cannot be addressed in a sustainable way, social and economic sustainable way, if you do not permit the inhabitants of the watershed or the territorial unit to make decisions about their economies and how their well-being is being taken care of. So as a water authority, you have no control over agriculture subsidies, over tourism developments, over mining permits. How do you manage a watershed like that? How could you manage water without the territory? And how do you manage territory without the proper economic and social incentives to use land well, to preserve forests, and to use better your energy? Let's remember that the Kutsamala system is the single biggest user in 1 point of energy in the whole country. For this, I would like to thank a lot of people, but we've been working for 4 years with 126 experts from 17 different countries to build a new model on how to manage that specific vulnerable piece of not infrastructure, but territory that makes Mexico City and 20 million people in the urban area possible. So that's the challenge. We've been doing science and math to build a new language because there's a lot of investment that cannot pass through a typical benefit cost model. So we're building a new language there. We're building a new language with mining and with agriculture. We have one of the biggest touristic centers, lake, not coast, beach kind of centers, but one of the biggest cities in tourism in the region. We have the monarch butterfly region inside this catchment area. So we do have a diversity and complexity that does not allow typical paradigm and typical methodology for planning investment and to making it happen. Just to finalize, our two points that we think that we can make this happen through the next 30 years is, first of all, we are aligning in a platform every single kind of investment, NGO, public or private, to be aligned to a better land use and optimization of the source. We're involving the private sector and the Watershed Commission within the NGOs to oversee the platform and to let them be the ones that demand that politically and financially the platform continues through the time. So we do believe that we have a social strength and a financial ally in the Ministry of Finance by not allowing any public investment that is not aligned to the platform. So we have the power of money and the power of people overseeing that this platform can actually survive through politics in time. So we do believe that reducing demand by making water on leaks, using better, reusing better, re-injecting to the aquifer, and the resilience of its infrastructure, not letting the investments of so many Mexicans and generations to degrade by not putting the priority into maintenance and conservation of our systems. Thank you very much. This is one thing we share, and something that we are looking forward to keep on writing and publishing stuff, because we are willing also not only to learn from you guys, but also to share what we've accomplished in a very practical laboratory in the territory of Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Well done. Thank you, Fernando. Thanks to our speakers for providing a glimpse of the state-of-the-art of science and its application. We will have a couple of sessions this afternoon that'll take a deep dive both on the Mexico City, Valley of Mexico case. That's at 2 o'clock. And then on the tools, science and engineering approaches to designing for freshwater resilience. And that's at 4 o'clock. So we encourage you to come back to those two deep dive sessions and geek out with us a bit. Here we can just give a broad overview. Can you cue up the next slide, please? Thank you. Johan described water as the driving state and control variable, guiding changes in the biosphere and guiding the human endeavor. Together, these combined to constitute water really as the master variable for navigating social ecological transformations towards resilience in the modern era. Advances in science and ingenuity have long enabled humans to overcome limits to growth and fueled remarkable progress. And now our growing knowledge of water offers an opportunity to confidently tackle the challenges of a complex and changing world with water as a master variable. And why is water a master variable? Well, water, as Johan also noted, is central to the functioning and resilience of the biosphere. Along with temperature, the availability and variability of water guides the distribution and diversity of the Earth's terrestrial biota and regulate biome stability. At local and regional scales, water limits human settlement, agriculture, and industry. Our technological ingenuity has overcome many of these limits, at least temporarily, by damming and diverting water from natural source areas to places where humans would like to live and produce. But as humanity has progressively settled and transformed the Earth, we've reached water limits that cannot be solved by conventional engineering and current technologies. Compounded by growing demand and climate change, water is increasingly becoming our greatest vulnerability for global agricultural breadbaskets, cities, economies, and society as a whole. Now, our ability to mitigate climate change and preserve a safe environment and biosphere for humanity is humanity's existential challenge. But within the bounds of climate change to which we are already committed, water will be our most immediate and acute resource crisis, and water must guide human transitions in the modern era. The vulnerability of our global food system to groundwater depletion is sobering evidence of nested water-related risks. This alarming study profiles the state of groundwater depletion in critical global breadbaskets, revealing that by pumping deeper and faster to fuel unsustainable growth, we have our pedal to the metal towards collapse of the global food system. Recognition of the profound water change and our vulnerability has sparked innovation in tools to predict and to manage for resilience to uncertain water futures. Water as a master variable offers a systematic approach to understand complex, changing human systems and to chart a future course for the resilience of people and planet. And this approach allows for a consistent and comparable assessment of development options, as yet intractable in our efforts to address the complexity and uncertainty that the future holds. Now, how can water offer a simpler, coherent approach to designing for resilience? We start with a common denominator, the freshwater ecosystem that underpins water function and human benefit. We increasingly understand what is required for freshwater resilience, as measured by key environmental variables for wholly natural as well as modified freshwater ecosystems. When thresholds for these controlling variables are surpassed, freshwater ecosystems lose their function and productivity, become unstable and less resilient. And general resilience derives from this ecological underpinning. Controlling variables for general resilience include those for specified freshwater resilience, as well as social and economic variables in consistent categories that I've described here, but defined for a particular sector or system. And while these are not sufficient to assess and design for general resilience, there are certainly other variables. Water is essential for such design. This water-specific approach to general resilience is applicable to diverse sectors and systems, from food to energy to cities to nexus issues addressing the trade-offs among many sectors, given that water underpins any prospect of success in all of those human endeavors and the complex nested endeavors that we undertake. And indeed, water offers a clear and consistent lens to understand and solve for the nested complex systems that the Sustainable Development Goals require. As President Ader noted, the President of Hungary noted in the morning session, water is linked across the SDGs. The majority of the SDGs depend upon water, and the fate of those SDGs and human progress depends on water as a master variable. Now we'll move to a panel dialogue with leaders from public, private, and civil society institutions at the heart of efforts to build resilience through fresh water. Please please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists: Jennifer Serra, Director of Water Global Practice at the World Bank; Betsy Otto, Director of the Global Water Program at the Water Resources Institute; Arnoldo Matos Kramer, Chief Resilience Officer of Mexico City; Victoria Granstrom, Environmental Lead for IKEA; and Mark Fletcher, Global Water Lead for Arup. Wherever you'd like. Wherever you'd like is fine. Wherever you'd like is fine. Thank you and welcome. Let me just get you some glasses for water. There we go. Terrific. So we're going to start the panel with general reflections on our complex and urgent development challenge. The clock is ticking for the Sustainable Development Goals and the human endeavor. And as Peter Thompson, President of the UNGA, noted, UN General Assembly noted in the opening plenary this week, SDG 6 needs a push. How are you, within your institutions, tackling the complexity of the SDGs and the climate agenda through efforts to improve water management? And what does resilience mean in that effort? How does water feature in your efforts to drive sustainability and resilience across that broad human agenda? And we'll start with Jennifer from the World Bank, if you would.
Thank you, Fred. Is this on? Yeah. So I'm sorry, I can't help it, but the World Bank is an institution filled with economists. So when you talk about the definition of resilience, we won't have 2 or 3 definitions, but if you put a team of economists in a room, we'll probably have 5 definitions. So I'd like that as an opening. But thank you again for organizing this session. And the question is, why is resilience important? And so we see it's an imperative in water, because access to water directly impacts human health, economic activity, and environmental quality. The World Bank, our objective is really to support the world free of poverty, is what we say we're trying to do, and help governments achieve the SDGs. And we see water is needed for 15 out of 17 of the SDGs. So what we see from our point of view when we support governments and invest in countries is, how do we help populations have access to the infrastructure, services, and institutions in the long term that will help them develop and sustain and grow. From the government side, we're seeing more and more is that they're trying to protect the value of the costly assets they're putting in place. And they realize they cannot afford to replace assets, as there are so many other services that need to be delivered. So in the water global practice, we have 5 priority themes. And I need to thank Fred, because for many, many years, we worked on sustainability, inclusion, institutions, and financing, leveraging financing. And Fred came to the World Bank a couple years ago and said, well, you need to talk about resilience. And we said, well, no, resilience is sustainability. And we had a long debate about that. So we've actually now really have incorporated resilience into the work we're doing. There were examples given on the analytical work and the tools we're making with the decision tree. But in our investments, we have about $25 billion of investment just in the water sector. We're seeing our client countries are demanding and requesting different types of support. So be it flood risk management projects in Manila, Ho Chi Minh City, Dakar, or drought management in the Horn of Africa, Sao Paulo, and Northeast Brazil, or now new initiatives on coastal zone erosion. So what's interesting, though, is that we still are linking different countries. We're looking at the hydrologic cycle from different elements. And I think it's much more important. I really like this presentation, where we need a much more holistic view of the water cycle at a country level and a watershed level. So let me stop there right now.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And just for the audience's understanding, we're going to proceed first with a round of interventions on that general question of how are we addressing the complexity of the SDGs, what does resilience mean, and how is that playing out in your efforts as institutions? And we'll just go down the chain. Betsy, if you would, next.
Sure. First of all, I'm really delighted with this discussion and really appreciated the presentations and some of the ideas that I've been hearing, all week long. I would say at World Resources Institute, we're thinking all the time about how to build resilience into our core work, which is to provide information and more transparency of information globally to all users, open data, to help people really get a better handle on what they're facing in terms of water-related risks, whether that's in the private sector, national or subnational governments, cities, and so on. And I'm excited, too, about the promise, anyway, of SDG 6.4. For the first time, I think across all of the targets within SDG 6, there's some very, very important elements, but I think 6.4 really starts to get at something that we've never been willing to try to calculate before or measure, which is how sustainably are we managing the water resources that we do have, sort of on a quantity scale. And of course, quality and all the other elements, integrated water management and protection of ecosystem services all matter in that as well. But I think that could be a game changer if really we start to have a sort of benchmark against which all countries, by the way, not just developing countries, are measuring themselves. It could start to create an accountability mechanism. At least that's the hope. And I would mention just a couple examples of things that we've been involved in that I think are reasons to be hopeful, as challenging as the situation that we find ourselves in globally around water is. And I'll just sort of enumerate them. The first is in China, where the government, I would argue, is trying to step up to the realities of the really tremendous water challenges that it faces by setting its 3 red line targets. There aren't many other countries that have been willing to do that. without a limit, for example, on water withdrawals. Let's take the example of some work we're doing in northern Ningxia province, actually with some support from the Rockefeller Foundation, to work within that target that's been set for the Yellow River Basin. Ningxia is almost at that limit, and yet it's growing very rapidly in its cities and industries. Where is the water going to come from? In the meantime, half the population lives on small farms. They're using flood irrigation, extremely inefficient irrigation, but an important part of the breadbasket for the country. And so another element of what the government is doing is piloting water trading programs, water rights allocation and trading programs. And so we've been very closely involved with the government there in establishing how would you do water rights allocation down to the village and down to the individual farmer level, and it's complex. And then how can you do trading where industry and cities can make on-farm efficiency investments, take some of that saved water and use it for economic growth. I think that's a really interesting idea. Obviously, it's fraught with challenges. We'll see if China can do it, but it's piloting this across 8 provinces, and it wants to take that effort national, and I give them credit for it. Another example I would say would be in Ethiopia, extremely challenged, of course, second largest population in Africa, rapidly growing, over 100 million people. The government has made a real commitment to green growth as a core notion of what it wants to do, and yet it has extremely ambitious 5 and 10 and 15-year growth plans. And if you look across irrigation, agro-processing, industrial growth, cities growth, hydropower, it's literally not possible for them to meet all of their goals with the way they're currently managing water. And so we're working with the Ministry of Water, and there are many other partners that are involved in these kinds of efforts with the government to try to highlight where are the areas where these choke points exist across those different sectors, really understanding those connections, and then looking for interventions, whether they're efficiency investments or whether they're upstream investments, for example, in restoration. The famous Tigre example of a completely denuded landscape, which is now a very productive landscape, and which the primary benefit of which in that restoration work has been recovering the groundwater table. The last example, thank you for letting me go on a bit, would be with the private sector. And again, the promise of this remains to be seen, but there's an initiative underway with the CEO Water Mandate, WRI, Nature Conservancy, WWF, and CDP, to create a system by which companies that want to be leaders in setting watershed-based targets for reducing water demand can do that in a scientifically based way. And what's intriguing about this, in many basins we know that demand is up here and available renewable supply is down here. And the question is, how are you going to bridge that gap? What are the sort of cost curves that could actually reduce that imbalance? And companies have been very reluctant to engage here, but they know they have to, because they can't do with their supply chains or their own operations, they can't do everything themselves. And I think the promise of this is that it could create de facto caps, if you want, sustainable yield caps, that government and the private sector could start to work with together. So those are 3 examples of places where I see hope.
Terrific. Thank you, Betsy. Arnoldo, you have, speaking of major populations, you have the extraordinary opportunity and daunting challenge of working with within the government of the City of Mexico to forge solutions founded on resilience for a population of nearly 22 million in the greater Mexico City region and growing, with projections of acute declines in water availability, as Fernando noted, huge dependency on external sources of water. And like many cities around the globe, have embraced resilience as the paradigm. Mexico City recognizes the need to be able to adapt to and transform under change. Describe to us your approach for addressing that complexity, given multiple demands of social growth, economic growth, and opportunity, and a changing and uncertain natural resource base.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. Well, for sure, water is at the core of the resilience strategy of Mexico City. It's linked to many of the different risks, future risks of the city related to climate change, to the maintenance of the infrastructure within the city, and also with other risks like earthquake risks. So we identified that right from the beginning, and our approach was, well, we need to have like a transversal, multi-stakeholder approach, because we see that this is not just related, as Fernando mentioned, just to the water authorities. It's a finance issue, but also it's a planning issue, not just at the ecosystem level or the basin level, but also at the urban level. So one of the challenges is how we integrate with a common vision the different stakeholders to work together for building water resilience. And there it's quite important to build a narrative of the key risks that the city is facing for the future. And I will give you an example. We are overexploiting our aquifer. It's one of the main stresses for the city. And no one knows exactly when we are going to run off that source of water, but the estimate is 30, 40 years. But that's more than half of the water supply for the city. And at the same time, we are experiencing droughts in areas like California or Sao Paulo, which are a good example of what can happen in such a mega city like Mexico City. So this is an issue of national security. At the end, by the year 2030, the megalopolis will be around 30 million people. So we are not prepared to experience a mega drought, a long, prolonged drought within the central region of Mexico. So we need to change our paradigm in terms of moving into the sustainability of our aquifer, just to have it as a kind of as a secure base to survive. And that's not happening at the moment. We have very different problems towards that, and a lot of inefficiencies. And I think the other issue is how do we push for innovation in terms of rethinking the public space and introducing green infrastructure in a very complex environment where there are very different interests and scarce resources. And I think we are into that voyage where we require kind of the help and the thinking of many organizations globally, but also nationally. And I think that's on the core also on the sustainable development of the city itself.
Thank you very much. Victoria, IKEA has been a global leader in sustainability. We spoke the other day about the importance of water risks to the company and the company's progressive efforts to mitigate its footprint, so to speak, to increase efficiency. And it's something that you are keenly interested in throughout the supply chain, not just because it's a company that's committed to doing good, but because it is of material importance to your long-term financial returns, sustainability, and mitigating risks. And we spoke of examples of energy systems dependent upon water resource and IKEA's very progressive efforts to understand and articulate the level of that risk. Share with us some of your experiences in trying to diagnose the level of the extent to which water is embedded in the promise of your industry, the profits and risks related to water change.
I'm trying to do that in a few minutes. I represent the global IKEA Water Group. We have been cooperating throughout from, you can say, from supply chain to own operations, all the way to design of products since a few years. So I represent the global water group here. I have been working with water since 2008, lab engineering, lab solutions. What the co-workers ask is, just tell us what to do. We know why. Just tell us what to do and we will do it. The complexity in this is we are present in 51 countries at least with stores. We have industries in 10 countries with collaboration with national authorities and local authorities. To care for people and planet is our core value, so we include all the SDGs in our sustainability plan, our strategy, our corporate strategy, people and planet, positive. And to find then the solutions in every step of in this case, water stewardship, to become to work with the water stewardship, the 5 steps, so to say. So we have created awareness, we have created knowledge about impact, and now we are facing the menu of finding engineering solutions that can be used globally, that according to local need together with other stakeholders. And it's not the same. It's not the same. So we need to have one menu for each local authority that we are handling and make sure that we can collaborate with each of these regions in all the aspects of the SDGs. We cannot leave one part and just work for long-term business. We need to incorporate all companies around us, all stakeholders, and also one important part of our stakeholders, and I want to stress that is our customers. They expect us to do this right. And they also expect us to offer them the solutions so that when they go to the store and see the messages about the water-stressed area, they see the impact it has on society, they also get inspired to do something. That is one of an important message for us. And we reach out to, I've told it's twice today, 736 million visits in our stores, 400 stores in 51 countries. And we can actually inspire them to change behavior. We can inspire them to push local authorities to demand cooperation from all the stakeholders in a local community. So I hope that we can use this power as a messenger to a change of behavior.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Mark, Arup has for several years now partnered closely with the Rockefeller Foundation to embrace resilience as a paradigm for approaches to engineering the future at a city scale. I have the great pleasure and pride of announcing that we've just yesterday launched an additional partnership which focuses on city water resilience planning. Very pleased about that. Mark, if you would, why is resilience the right paradigm for Arup, the global engineering leader, as you architect the future of cities, water systems,
So we'll take a step back. It's now a couple of years since we passed the point where more people are living in cities than in rural areas. And as our populations increase, we see not just the rise of the city, but the rise of the megacity. So we think that city resilience, which is the first work which we did with the Rockefeller, it's really important to get that from core principles, which we've done. As we start to look at water in cities and resilience of water, it's important that we don't look at that at a sort of city boundary, but very much has been shared by all the earlier presentations. It's not just the basin in which the city exists, but the dependence of the city on basins. And I think in Mexico, it's a number of basins. So another key thing is to recognize the city exists within the water cycle and that we want to operate at a basin scale. That water cycle then gets subject, and the city itself gets subject to what I would call, we've heard shocks and stresses. I think I saw black elephants, but we have the term black swans. Those are the really extremely high impact but low probability events. And I think in many ways what Casey was saying earlier, when we have events, it's really important that we learn how to consider about coping when our design events are exceeded, and it's important that we deal with them. The last point is that across that water cycle at each stage, different organisations and actors are involved. And I think that there's an awful lot more we could do with engaging all of the actors across the cycle before that cycle gets stressed and flexed. And in that way, I think we'll get much more sustainable solutions from an economic, environmental, technical and social perspective.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for those terrific introductory remarks. So there's a common challenge that we all face, certainly. We recognize the need for a concept like resilience, given the magnitude of change that we're experiencing, the uncertainty and surprises that happen from one day to the next. We saw a film of the airport in Mexico City, completely inundated. Houston, unfortunate, another case of just enormous surprise. There's growing understanding of what resilience means as a framework for addressing complexity, and you've articulated in your different endeavors how that makes sense in international development investment to address the needs of the poorest of the poor and any prospect of sustainable development, to examples from China, Ethiopia, Mexico City, across industry and engineering for the future. What's missing? What do you find in your daily practice the most acute need for transitioning from embracing that notion, that concept of resilience, to applying it in action? And if I could, Arnoldo, let me start with you, because you have the distinction and the considerable challenge of bringing resilience into the central planning and efforts of the government of Mexico City, which is dealing with competing demands from a multitude of sectors on a daily basis. Doesn't have time to think forward 30 years to how do we plan for long-term progress, but recognizes that it needs to. And what's missing as you approach and engage the government in embracing resilience as a paradigm for change?
I think one key consideration, and it was a great introduction by Fernando, this is an issue that needs a vision at the basin level or at the regional level. So one big restriction is within Mexico City's boundaries, we are about 8 million people, but we are talking about a metropolitan area of 22 million. And if we consider the entire region, it's about 27 million people. So the coordination of all those authorities with a common vision, it's missing, I would say. I mean, it's not yet there. So resilience actually is a great opportunity to build that vision. And we put that into the resilience strategy of Mexico City, that we want to have a regional resilience agenda. And if we build that, that may be related to water, because it's the most common sense. And then the other thing that I would like to say is, like, we need to show resilience on practice. So the work that we are doing at the different system levels that supply water to Mexico City need to be transformed into real projects that we can show the main stakeholders, and then we need to build this dialogue with the key finance ministries so that they understand that the integration of resilience needs to come with funding projects that bring multi-benefits to the communities. And I think we are moving into that direction, but we are still need to build those projects within Mexico City, and I think at some point that will be a cascade of projects that will come in the coming future.
Terrific, thank you very much. Victoria, please, yes.
I would love to comment on that one. Practical solutions. I can say that in many of the cases and many of the countries, we have the menu of technical solutions already there. What we lack is motivational factors. Collaboration with other stakeholders. It can be value of water, it can be competence, it can be the long-term sort of view and goal that the region has or the country has. So we are just waiting for the window of opportunity at all cases, because if it opens, we can act. If the law changes or if we have a collaboration group of stakeholders, we can act. So this is how we do. We're such a big company, so we act all the time when we do have the opportunity to do it. And the solutions are there. It's not about the engineering so far. The curve goes like this, but we're just in the start, so it's not that. It's the collaboration, the responsibility to take the, to be the leader and dare to do the right thing so far, I would say.
Terrific. Well, thank you for taking the lead on that yourself and as an industry. We do need those leaders, those that take the first steps. Betsy, you wanted to come in on this point as well?
I was just going to build on what Victoria just said. I mean, I think that we lack political will and accountability to do, in many instances, what we know we need to do. Not that it's easy by any means, but there's really no penalty for not managing water well right now from a standpoint of a government. Now, I think for companies, many don't want to look at that, but I think many companies in a leadership role realize that they have material risk to their business if they don't. And in many instances, companies are being pressed by investors and by the financial markets to disclose on those risks and to show that they're taking actions. Why isn't this happening in the same way with government? And of course, there's a lack of capacity, there's institutional fragmentation. Those things I think are really, really challenging. But I think we also need to do a better job of translating the very things that we've been talking about into, frankly, economic terms, which will get the attention of the national planning commissions and the finance ministers. I'll give an example of a blog that we just did recently. We've just created a data set using big data, using Google Earth and machine learning to create a data set of all the power plants in India, their generating capacity and also their cooling type. This has not existed before. And we've created this methodology that can now be scaled up globally, which we're very interested in doing. And then we went to the web and we scraped data on electricity outages in the past year that were reported by the government of India. What we discovered is that the water-related electricity outages were the equivalent of, I think it was 14 terawatts of energy last year, enough energy to have powered Sri Lanka for an entire year, for just one company that equated to $3 billion in lost revenues. That's not the knock-on effects. So that's the kind of thing that we need to translate why when you don't have enough water or we're not managing water well, what that means to a Minister of Finance.
Thank you. Jennifer, please. Yes.
Sorry, I hear Minister of Finance. I have to grab the microphone. But we had a really nice breakfast this morning with a number of CEOs in the private sector. We talked a lot about data and innovation and technology. And it was very interesting because the conclusion of the breakfast, I think, was really that's the easy part. And how do we go back and deal with the new, what we'll call the new institutional engineering, the new institutional architecture of different types of partnerships and long-term vision. And I think that's what's coming out of this panel, how important it is. But I also think that we still need to go back to the basics sometimes. And so I'll give an example of Vitória, the city, the capital of Espírito Santo in Brazil, where we've been working with the water utility for many, many years just to improve access to basic services to water and sanitation. And the cost of water treatment has gotten higher and higher. And it's obviously from the upstream water use and the planting of coffee and non-native species that's been increasing the sediment load and the pollution load, but also the untreated wastewater treatment. So then it's realized you need a watershed approach and strategies for payment for environmental services that go way beyond the water utility, go beyond the municipal boundaries, and go way upstream and cover a much broader set of partners, farmers, private sector, et cetera. At the same time, if you look at the pricing of the city, of the water pricing and the tariffs, it's incredibly low, and the water losses are huge. So they're leaking 40 or 50% of the water is being lost. So we have many, many cities around the world where this is happening. So I think also the resilience, we need a broader definition of resilience as well to look at pricing. I'm sure Hank will talk about valuing water, but I think that's going back to the basics is also important.
Thank you.
I get to contribute.
Please come on in. Yes, of course.
I think a couple of important things. I'd first like to say that it's important we try and be consistent in our language. I think that helps us if we're all talking about the same things. And I'd extend that particularly to our academic friends, so that we don't just reinvent terms for the same things to generate papers. It's really important that we try and get practical with this. I think we need a framework of understanding and building on work that's already done. And Rockefeller, I think, have led the way globally from a city resilience perspective that's allowed us to build on that from a water resilience perspective. So I think always acknowledging the context, because context is the most important thing we lose sometimes when we try and transfer. We've got to share our learning, what's worked and what hasn't. And then lastly, I'd like to say that we do have leadership. The King as champions water resilience, and the President from Hungary today, as eloquently as anybody as I've ever seen, has championed the issues. It would be great. I'm humbled that our government isn't there doing enough, and it would be great if other governments could follow that lead and again be consistent in the message. I think that's important.
Thank you very much. So, Jennifer, I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, which is our initial dialogue at the bank on incorporating resilience into the approach of the bank to addressing the world's water challenges, and particularly those of the most acute in need of water solutions. We found a terrific partner in Mexico and Mexico City and the Valley of Mexico. It's not always easiest to convey this novel paradigm to client countries. What's been the reception of your client network to this concept of resilience as a means of addressing sustainability challenges, given that there are such urgent, pressing challenges of energy need, food insecurity, et cetera, that could take countries away from embracing that complexity of long-term planning and design?
That's a good question. I really like what Victoria said. Right now, it's no longer about why, but it's how. So the more we travel around the world, I was just in Tanzania, and the same thing, the government is really, really struggling now with how to allocate water against the competing needs. So in part of the country, they have a drought, and they're saying, how do we have enough water to generate hydropower, but also save our hippopotamus population in the national parks, which is also leading our tourism industry. And then when we look there, why is there not enough water in the national park? It really is because of the diversion to irrigation. It wasn't watershed depletion. So coming back to the session about policy and science and the importance of science, and good research is critical to find the right solutions. So I think that's very important. I really think bringing us all together in academia as well, and agree with the definitions that we really, but I do see there's an uptake. People want to have solutions and sharing knowledge.
Thank you very much. We have about a minute left. If anyone has any dying remarks, then please put your hand up. If not, I want to ask another question. Victoria, please, yes.
Sorry for that. I have
No,
just
no,
a
no, no.
rhetorical
I appreciate
question.
your enthusiasm.
If we look at industries and long-term business planning, who owns the rain? Are we allowed to just use it? Because then we can be self-sufficient, independent. But is that the way we're going to work? Do we believe that?
Right.
It's just to open up, because I think the authorities and stakeholders around us should be aware of that thought. And we need to stress the fact that we need to collaborate to have all stakeholders included.
Excellent, thank you. Fernando?
I would say that to work on strategic communication, it's quite important, because there are very important stakeholders that they have a very different kind of mandate in terms of the time spent. So, for example, in the legislators, that they see their mandate at 3 years role, at least in Mexico. And I think that's one of the main constraints to work on these long-term agendas. So if we are very strategic to whom to communicate, why is that important, and what are the key messages, that's something we can progress.
Thank you very much. Thank you, friends. It's a wrap. Thank you for a terrific dialogue, and more importantly, thank you for what you do every day for people and planet through a lens of water resilience. Really terrific. Thank you very much. And speaking of water and resilience, we're honored to have whom I consider the preeminent global agent of positive change on these critical topics, Mr. Henko Vink, who is, this is not a joke, I'm totally serious. Henko Vink, who worked closely with the Rockefeller Foundation to bring the concept of resilience into a response to Superstorm Sandy, to take it across the United States and across the world, all founded on an approach to better managing water, and is now Special Envoy for International Water for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Henk,
well, Fred,
welcome.
Thank you so much. What an introduction.
Those are mine.
Oh, those are yours.
Thanks.
Okay, just want to make sure we leave nothing behind. I was asked to reflect on both panels. One, and we're on resiliency. But first, a personal note, thanks to your introduction. Yeah. Cope with shocks and stresses. Huh? We're okay. Yeah. A personal note, and that's to IKEA, as an example for resiliency on how we respond to shocks and stresses. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, the IKEA in Red Hook became a resiliency center, a community center, first aid. They opened doors because they were on high ground, while the rest of Red Hook was actually flooded, and immediately provided a center for aid. Now, this was not designed for that, and because that built into one of the things that came out of the panel in the first part of the second. There are tipping points, but there are also ends. You design a system for an extreme, you can calculate or engineer, but then when reality tips over, the system falls apart. Then again, our society is much more capable of introducing a granular, comprehensive way of building a city or a region or a watershed, where the design is not end-based, but more open-ended. IKEA was not designed to be a community center, but it functioned 100% perfect. And it led to a discussion on, should all our libraries in the New York region become resiliency centers? So all of a sudden, we were again trying to plan everything right exactly for that once in 100 year, once in 1,000 years event. So there's this mix between engineer your way out of a disaster or plan a society with that type of flexibility and redundancy that it can cope with those shocks and stresses. The second thing which really struck me was that the first debate was very abstract in a way. You know, sometimes I find myself in the basement of the UN building in New York, locked in for a day to talk policy. Jennifer is laughing. And while that sounds funny, it's also a necessity. Because the UN we have the UN. We come together as countries. That is unique in itself. But it's not the reality. It's part. So I liked the first remarks, is that we have to bring the world to the UN and all these other stakeholders so they can relate to whatever happens there, but at the same time, bring that UN to the world, step down. This is again building into what we're trying to do with the high-level panel on water, is that it's not a panel of policymakers or ambassadors or Sherpas or heads of state and government that sit in a room and talk to the bigger water questions. But these are sitting heads of states and heads of governments. They run countries 24/7. They are responsible. Whatever they say cannot be a funny thing or a game or something that they can ignore. They have to put that in practice immediately. So this type of a panel, which luckily only has 2 years, so it's very action-oriented, it's really like a task force, has to take everything they do serious. Now last, perhaps, taking the values of water as we need them across the board, taking these conversations on resiliency serious, there's this need to ensure that we don't forget this long term. The first speaker of the second panel who showed us all the science of the world and therefore brought us that insight, it's a critical necessity. We need to know more. And of course, I agree, the awareness is there. We don't need more on the why, although I come in a lot of places where the why actually is not there, but I agree. But the science should help lead us to solutions by design, by innovation. That science is the long term, but science has options, and we're out of time for too many options. So science should also help to put itself into practice. We find a way by collaboration to let science join, like academia join, policy join, business join, community join, multi-stakeholder organization. So there are scenarios, there are options actually can turn into resilient practices that really make a difference. So that's long-term comprehensiveness. Second, inclusion. Yes, we need to include all. And we all know how difficult it is. For a government to say, I open my doors before I know what I want. For a business to say, you become part of my business case before I know what the end deal is. For a community to have trust in a government that left them behind for so long, and so forth. But inclusion is critical, not only for the awareness, not only for the ownership, but actually everyone in the game has an idea and an interest that matters for a resilient outcome. Third, transparency, for accountability, talked about. But transparency next to accountability, for business sector important, for their stakeholders and stockholders, for government in a democracy. But transparency is critical for learning, and we forget that. That's the fun part of transparency, is that we fail, make mistakes, and because of that, we actually do better tomorrow, and we'll fail again, and we'll do a little more better then. So that brings long-term into short-term actions. Now, the question is, can we really be innovative enough? Can we leapfrog into that resilient future? Yep. I think if we can connect those 4 dots, we build capacity, and that capacity is among all. And it's among the UN in its institutions and the institutional change that is needed. That is capacity among businesses to help us value water right. That's capacity among communities to put to practice what they experience every day. That's capacity among governments to really act upon the promise. And it's also the capacity, and this is my last remark, to bypass our systems. One critical remark in the second panel was, whatever we developed is based on what we knew yesterday. Mm-hmm. Our responses are responses to the disasters of the past. Our systems are designed based on policy. And a policy paper is not based on the science of the future, it's based on the science of yesterday. It's always too late, it's always too old. So if we want those solutions that really capture the future, we have to find mechanisms, collaborations, platforms that grab that future as an inspiration for new solutions, and those solutions can drive the change of the system, not the other way around. And that means working with the young, with the innovators, and so forth. And I've been talking and meeting with so many youngsters here in Stockholm and Torkny. Thank you so much for bringing them in. They have the ideas. They sometimes lack the network and access. They sometimes lack capacity. They definitely lack funding, but they have the ideas, and they are committed to change the world.
Thank you, sir.
First, thanks a lot, Fred, for a fantastic session. And Henk, yes, thanks. And Rockefeller Foundation for co-convening this session together with SIWI. I cannot think of any other place where you get state-of-the-art knowledge on water issues as of today, bringing together the climate agenda and the development, or the 2030 development agenda. To me, this was covering from research to reality. And now we have the reality check. We will convene next year again to bring together all of you, maybe more will come, to discuss where we are on actions to put our act together. Otherwise, we will maybe end up with this image of New York if we don't put our act together. Yes. Now it's action. Next year in July, there will be this high-level political forum looking into the SDG 6 and other meetings taking place. But we will convene next year as well to discuss and find where we are more action-oriented on development agenda and climate agenda. So thanks for being with us this morning. Thanks a lot.